kind of what you've been trying to make happen is a debate between Nick Land and Zizek.
Yeah.
And you were somehow able to interview Nick Land,
hmm
you and Dave, which is pretty crazy. That guy's a hermit. But, a debate with Zizek and Nick Land, what's the logic behind that? And how has that process been?
The point of it is it would be important to highlight the fundamental differences between their positions on metaphysics, on the nature of desire.
This divide between the Žižekian perspective and the Landian perspective being kind of more emblematic of a broader divide between people who are Hegelians and Lacanians versus people who more gravitate to Nietzsche and Deleuze. If I recall correctly, you came to the idea because you had breakfast with Zizek.
Yeah.
And tell us about that.
Yes.
That's crazy. Get breakfast with Zizek.
Okay. So I'll tell you,
Fascinating in itself.
this is a fun story. So in 2018, Dave and I presented talks at the International Zizek Conference in Athens, Georgia, and great time. And Zizek obviously is the keynote. Well, I ended up winning like the outstanding graduate paper award for the conference. And for them, it was a big deal because they found out that I'd never graduated from anywhere. Because of that, I got to have breakfast with Zizek. And it was cool. It's really cool. We talked Fight Club and, he ended up, I asked him, I said, okay, Slavo, I got to know what's your favorite thing about traveling to America? And he goes, oh, best thing is.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with a very special guest, a good friend of mine, Michael Downs, author of a brand new book, which you must get in the description, called Capital vs. Timenergy, a Žižekian critique of Nick Land. From what I've read so far, very interesting. And why you should listen to what Mikey says, hear it from me. This guy I call the Will Hunting of online philosophy because he's never even been a university and hasn't been a university, has become a philosopher. And when I say a philosopher, I don't mean a e-philosopher who just, thinks thoughts and tweets them or writes a few things and calls themselves that. I'm talking about someone who's considered legit by actual philosophers like Zizek, like Todd McGowan, and to a certain extent by Nick Land, by the very person Mikey is criticizing. And without further ado, I'll let you introduce yourself, Mikey. But the first question, the obvious thing is, why did you write goddamn 700 pages on Nick Land and Zizek? How'd you do this? Were you on Adderall?
No,
Were you on Adderall like Nick Land?
No, that's Nick's thing, or it was Nick's thing. So actually, no. Basically, I'm a, I get called different things: working class, autodidact, working class, intellectual. Our preferred term for it is underground theorist. But basically, I at this point in my life, and for the last 5 years, I've worked at a warehouse. And what I do is I work at the warehouse, and then I go in, I clock in roughly around 6:30 in the morning and leave at 3. And that's a hard schedule to work. But the good thing about it is because I get off at 3, I can go directly to a coffee shop and write or read whatever for 3 or 4 hours after work. And that's basically how I wrote the thing. I just, for every single day after work, I'd go to the coffee shop for 3 or 4 hours. For whatever reason, I can't write when at home. So I have a couple of my core coffee shops I always go to. And yeah, that's how I did it, was just going and doing it after work. Now, the research aspect of it is, before I was doing this job at the warehouse, I had a lot more of what we call time energy or relative time energy. And I was, in other words, I had more time and energy to devote to study and to writing. And so I had this weird philosophical development. Yeah. Where I didn't go to college. I didn't graduate high school. I do have a GED, but when I was 21, I just developed a kind of immediate, instantaneous love for philosophy. And throughout my 20s, I couldn't help it became my passion. I had to study philosophy every day, even though I didn't plan on doing anything with it. I never planned on writing. I just loved learning philosophy. So that became the thing I wanted to do the most. In my 30s, I started realizing like maybe I do want to write one day, but it was far off. And in my 30s, that's when I really started getting into the philosophers that are essential to me, like Zizek and Land and Deleuze and Lacan and all those guys. I got into them later. Like, in my 20s, I was focused on Sartre, Descartes, and Hume, and Kant, and Heidegger, and Marx, and all those guys. And so in my 30s, I got into the guys I focus on now. But again, still really didn't have any plans to do anything with it. I was like, well, how can I? I don't even have a real high school diploma. I did take some classes at community college, and my teacher, Doug Washer, really changed my life. I took his philosophy classes, and that was it as far as like real education goes. But Doug changed my life. It was like a crash course in philosophy from him. But other than that, it really wasn't until 30, somewhere around 38, maybe 36, 37, I started wanting to write more, and just started to get in the habit of always writing something when I was at the coffee shop, whether it was just a Facebook post or a short blog post or whatever. And I just kind of developed the habit of writing every single day. And now it's something I just do on autopilot. So that was it. So I learned about Nick Land and Deleuze and Guattari and Zizek prior to writing the book, right? But when it came to write the book, it took me about a year to do it, and just going to the coffee shop after work and chipping away at it. No Adderall involved.
Yeah, it is something I had to ask because it's about Nick Land and the CCRU,
Mhm.
which were notorious for being this sort of philosophy clique that would get together and do tons of Adderall and other things, and then have raves and talk about philosophy, write philosophy. And then that kind of didn't go so well for Nick regarding the Adderall after. But, the first question to get into is, if you're talking about Nick Land, and it is useful for people to know where you're coming from,
Sure.
because when you see a guy who wrote about Nick Land, it's like,
Yeah.
why is he so fascinated by what Nick Land has to say?
Mhm.
And I mean, already in like the preface, you describe yourself kind of as a leftist without a left,
Yeah.
which I thought was an apt, interesting characterization. What did you mean by that? Because, you know, people sometimes throw labels at people, like Theory Underground sometimes gets called post left. But what do you mean by a leftist without a left?
I kind of just mean it in a naive sense. And I guess I'm using the word naive in a positive way here. But the basic principles of the leftist tradition, universal emancipation, some sort of principle of, universal equality. I guess I'm a defender of the universal in that sense. That's one of the ways that I'm different than Nick, because Nick wants to emphasize the particular. And so I think at the end of the day, though, if I say I'm a leftist without a left, it's that I think that to strive for the universal emancipation of time energy. So I'm just going to speak for myself here. I don't think that, the emancipation of time energy really works on a particular scale. I think it has to be something universal for it to count. Otherwise, it just collapses into a new type of classism where certain people have it. And I mean, whatever relative time energy humans have, it was typically the aristocrats that had it, right? And I think that if that's the case, it's just going to involve another social contradiction that is going to bring about antagonism. And the thing is, you really don't know what a human being as a singularity can do with their time energy until they have it. So there are plenty of aristocrats that didn't do anything remarkable having time energy. And there's all kinds of workers that could have done amazing things if they had had their time energy. I think that's part of it. I think on the level of the left, it's the only tradition that I've ever seen traces of where there's a real sense that we need to be emancipated from work, especially wage labor. I take it a step further. I would say necessary labor as, in general, but I think that's where my leftism comes in. I'm a leftist without a left because I don't think there's any, actually existing institutions or movements that are going to bring about any of these type of ideals. So that's kind of what I had in mind with that.
Yeah, the left-right distinction fascinates me, and it's something I actually want to do a whole arc on. It might be a video essay because, I mean, I feel like that label does resonate with me as well because I've been very, very critical of the left, what passes for it. But it's not something I'm willing to really dismiss entirely because if I were to define the left in the most simple way, at least in terms of like, what is the common denominator that unites movements that tend to be on the left? It's really a commitment to equality as opposed to the right being a commitment to hierarchy. Other than that, there's not a lot that actually splits that really defines the left and right that's consistent. You have tons of tendencies that don't agree with each other. And even the word change is misleading because, like, the left is usually pro progress, pro change, where the right is seen as conservation and reaction. But, like, Nick Land, I would say, and, totally disrupts that thinking, right? Like, Nick Land is kind of a thinker of constant change in many ways. Like, the accelerationism itself, right-wing accelerationism itself is like contradiction of the classical idea of right-wing ideologies being conservative or being reactive against change. It's very different from that. But yeah, it's an arc that interests me, and kind of that brings me to like what Nick Land believes, because Nick Land is seen to be on the right.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to explain what he believes. And I've even, asked people who claim to be followers of Nick Land what he believes. And a lot of the time they're just very vague about it. It's hard to tell if they even know themselves. But,
You
this
want me to
text
give it a
seems to
go?
be like,
You want me to give it a go of giving a summary of what he believes?
a little bit like, I would say perhaps how to put it, like an elevator pitch as to what Nick Land's philosophy is. And
Yeah.
I only ask that because, I mean, this is the closest I've seen to like an introductory text on what Nick Land believes.
No,
At least
I
like
try
the
to.
first couple chapters, like libidinal materialism.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all about like the evolution of Nick Land's thought. So yeah, I mean, what is this guy about? Because he's labeled all kind of things by various mainstream news articles that seem to miss the point.
Yeah. So let me do this. For me, I think it's helpful. I'm not saying, this is the end all be all way to summarize Land, but for me, this is the helpful way to think about it. I think there's 6 core periods or different periods to his thought. And that if you use this just as a pragmatic way of trying to get an idea of what he's about or how his thought has changed and progressed over the decades, this is it. So early Nick Land, and this is the Nick Land who wrote The Thirst for Annihilation and the majority of the early essays in a book called Fanged Noumena. Land back then is interested in what he calls libidinal materialism and what that tradition, he's trying to kind of retroactively interpret a tradition of philosophy together, right? So you can't do this without Kant, because the whole thing with noumena, that comes straight out of Kant, right? And for land in this early period, the noumenon is going to be matter itself, the creative, destructive potential of matter within the universe, right? And so he's going to interpret that type of energy or that type of matter as libido, right? So that's the libidinal materialism. And he thinks that human beings can't really process matter. Matter has this noumenal aspect, which is to say, it's something that we can't fully cognize. It's not something that we can fully understand. It's outside the scope of our ability to understand it, represent it, know it in the way that we know concrete objects like lamps or hammers or cats, right? So this land, he retroactively creates a tradition. You can't do it without Kant, but the core members of this tradition go Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Freud, Bataille, Deleuze and Guattari, and then up to Land. And so what he sees in all of them, Schopenhauer had this distinction between phenomena and noumena that he got from Kant, but for him, the noumenon is will. It's this kind of pure desiring, right? Nietzsche has will to power, Freud has libido, Bataille has the accursed share, and Deleuze and Guattari, you can talk about it in different ways, but they have the body without organs, or they have desiring production. And he sees this conceptual trajectory building from Schopenhauer going up to D&G, which he being kind of the culmination of this tradition. So early Land is interested in that kind of stuff. But early on, he's primarily focused on Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, and especially Bataille. Bataille's like his main guy. Once he reads Deleuze and Guattari, everything changes, and he really becomes a Deleuze-Guattarian. And it's important to realize, like, at this time when he was a lecturer at Warwick University, he became one of the world-renowned experts on Deleuze and Guattari. He was in the same league as, Brian Masumi and Manuel Delanda and all these famous Deleuzians, right? And he knew his D&G. Now, Deleuze-Guattarians now will say that his reading is a misreading, but nonetheless, he was very well versed in D&G. So what he gets from D&G, especially their book in Anti-Oedipus, and this kind of pivots us into the second period, which is this more mid-90s, the great theory fiction essay in Fang Noumena called Meltdown. It's kind of the main work of this era. And Deleuze and Guattari and Anti-Oedipus talk about how capitalism really is this engine of what they call decoding and deterritorialization. But what that means is capitalism is constantly uprooting things. Now, Marx knew this and Engels knew this. They talk about this in the Communist Manifesto, right? Capitalism comes around and it dissolves traditional culture, traditional identities. It uproots, it frees things up to become different things. It changes how labor is done. It goes from feudal labor into wage labor. And capitalism is this constant revolutionizing, especially of technology, right? And this is something that Nick Land really honed in on. And what he starts to do is take D&G's analysis of capitalism and mix it with cybernetics, and realizes, at least for him, that capitalism is geared towards the production of artificial intelligence. Like the famous Landian thesis is straightforwardly, capitalism is artificial intelligence. And that's what he's trying to do in this second period of the theory fiction, of the Meltdown stuff, where he's focused on capitalism in this very kind of techno-frantic cybernetic approach to it. And so that's what he's doing in the mid-90s. The third period, this is the one that is the oddest and most mysterious. This is where he and some of his students form the CCRU, the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit. And it is a kind of experimental philosophy collective, or it was, or it wasn't, because the CCRU never existed, as they like to say. But what it was is it was he and a group of young theorists who were interested in capitalism, cybernetics, pop culture. So this group consisted of it was Nick Land and Sadie Plant originally, but then a whole group of really influential thinkers were part of this. Mark Fisher, Reza Negarestani, Ian Hamilton Grant, Anna Greenspan. And then you had artists like Jake and Dinos Chapman and Steve Goodman, who goes by the Code 9. So who's a musician. So you have all these great, these artists and these philosophers. We're all part of this theory collective. But Land at some point really starts getting into the occult. So he gets into Aleister Crowley and Kenneth Grant. And I'm not even sure half the time what specific books he was reading, because he's never just said, here are my occult influences. But to many of us, it seems like he was reading Chaos Magic at the time. And a lot of this started to influence this concept of hyperstition, which is what the CCRU was all about. And it's all about how, fictions make themselves real. Really, what it boils down to is the ability of hype, especially in mass media and in mass culture, to take on a kind of cyber positive loop. It just keeps amplifying and amplifying. And these fictions have they gain enough material traction in the real world to actually become realities. And so the example, that I like to use on this is, can we imagine Donald Trump ever becoming president without all the memes and without Twitter and with all that? At first, it was a joke. Like growing up, if you had told me that Donald Trump would one day be my president, I would have laughed. Like it was impossible. Like that, a guy like that can't be president. And I don't think it could have happened without the meme hype that got him elected, in my view. So that's where you see a fiction making itself real through being hyped up, through memeing. And, and so we see another thing with the power of hyperstition, or the power of meme hype in AI today. So many, I see people go, oh, we shouldn't even worry about AI because it's just hype. It's just tech bros hyping it up to get investments, so to fund what they're doing. Yeah, but I don't think the fact that that's true should also blind us to how much potential there is in AI. And I feel like the hyperstition aspect of it can kind of function as ideology, where it makes us go, oh, we don't have to take this seriously. It's just tech bros hyping up something, when we should really be taking this technology seriously. So, okay, to bring it back though. So CCRU, they get into theory fiction, which is, it's writing in such a way as to incorporate philosophy. But for them, it was also an attempt to help bring certain futures into actuality. They're trying to hyperstition them into being. And so this is the era where they get heavy into drugs and all of this. And yeah, it culminates with Nick Land having an actual psychotic break due to the abuse of amphetamine. And I mean, he's even said that he doesn't really remember writing any of this stuff. And he kind of gives credit to what he calls the amphetamine god for all of this work.
And I have a theory. I'll get into why, and it's because I think you allude to like Nick Land, kind of actually, despite claiming to be like an atheist, Nick Land's god is ultimately capital, and I think it's because his worldview, takes the human agent out of the picture. It's like, in post-humanist, but in doing so, there's no subjective history. There actually is, but it's implicit. And I think that worldview of no subject, the human subject being able to drive history, and you have capital as like this kind of all-powerful amorphous thing. It's easy to substitute that with other things, that are more like spiritual,
Yeah.
whatever. It's a certain, I don't know how to put it. You could probably find Lacanian terms to describe it better. But
We can
what I think,
let me go to the next period real quick, and then we'll get back on more
all
solid
right,
ground.
yeah, because I was gonna, I have a way in which, at least my impression of the differences between Nick Land and the other CCRU members could be summed up kind of in like the transcendental miserableism
Sure.
part.
Sure.
I think that like is really the distinction. But yeah, you can go on to the
Real quick, look.
eras.
So,
Yeah.
so after all this occult stuff and the abuse of drugs, especially amphetamine, he has a psychotic break. Everybody around him said like he was clinically insane for a period. And after that, he and who would become his wife, Anna Greenspan, they relocate. They leave Warwick, they leave England, they head to the east, And eventually they moved to Shanghai, and they've been there ever since. And this era, once they get to Shanghai, part of what lured them there is this connection. Let's go back and just say he thinks that there's this profound connection between capitalism and the development of artificial intelligence. Okay. For him, he thinks that's going to occur in mega cities where intelligence gets concentrated the most. And he thinks the main mega city where this could happen is Shanghai. And so he enters this phase where he's focused on mega cities precisely because of how he sees them playing a role in the production of artificial intelligence. And yeah, he basically thinks that there's this possibility that AI could emerge as basically a whole network city, like the body of the city would be the body of the AI, more or less, something along those lines. And so this is his interest in urban areas and megacities, is how they act as accelerants of AI development. Okay, so that's kind of the stuff. Around 2007, 2008, like he does do more of a sharp turn to the right. He was already headed in that direction. And the fact that he has this fidelity to capitalism, even in the 90s, this is why he would say he was kind of playing rhetorical games with all the leftists he was around, because he had always been, a supporter of capitalism once he connected these dots. But in the fifth period, this is where he becomes the neo-reactionary guy on Twitter that, is famous for developing Neoreaction alongside Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug. And kind of to just brief summary, he starts reading Moldbug's blog, and this gets him thinking about alternative forms of government. And so both he and Yarvin, or at their heart, they're libertarians. They just want capital to be freed up to do what it's going to do, which for them, especially land, is it's going to keep developing technology, making more and more technological advancements. And that's why he doesn't want any restrictions or regulations put on capital. Okay. And so he sees in Yarvin, though, like, okay, we want libertarianism, but that at its most extreme, it believes or fights for the abolishment of the state. And they're like, okay, it's just not going to happen. You're not going to sell this to normies. What do you do as somebody who wishes libertarianism could happen, but also you're a state realist? Well, what you end up doing is you come up with Yarvin calls the Sov Corp, the sovereign corporation. What he wants is for corporations to basically own entire states.
Curtis Yarvin, for those wondering, the guy who was on New York Times recently, which is funny because I remember when my crackpot cousin in 2018 was showing me Mencius Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin, and it was like super niche, and now he's seen as, we'll get into this later, but influencing the Trump administration. I don't think he really is, but yeah.
Yeah, but he's got more of a name right now. So basically, it's the idea that, look, what we should do is have corporations actually be states. They should take on the role of the state. And so hypothetically, you could have like Starbucks own all of Missouri, and the people who live there would actually be employees. And it gets into this whole thing like, well, okay, how do you quit the Sov Corp? Well, they would say they believe in no voice, free exit. You don't get a democratic say in the Sov Corp. You don't get to vote. There are no elections because the board of directors, and especially the CEO, which for them is basically a monarch. It's like a capitalist king. Basically, the capitalist king and the board of directors govern what's going on. You don't get to vote. You don't get a say. It's completely anti-democratic, anti-democracy. But if you don't like it, you can always go live in another Sov Corp. It's basically the same logic of your actual job. Oh, you don't like working here? Fine. You don't have to be here. Nobody's forcing you to be here. Go get another job. The logistics of trying to like move to another Sov Corp and how that would all work. What if the other Sov Corps don't want you? There's all these logistical things that I have a lot of problems with, but that's what they're trying to do. The dark and light era period, which is this fifth period, it's really characterized by anti-democracy and the capitalists getting to actually just take over the function of the state. And they think that for land, that frees up capital to bring in the techno future of AI and all of that. And so that's where he's coming from with all the dark enlightenment stuff. The sixth period, that's when he gets really big into Bitcoin and what technological potentials are there with Bitcoin. But I mean, he wrote a book, he didn't finish it, called Cryptocurrent. And there's a lot of good stuff in it. Like it was shaping up to almost be his philosophical masterpiece, but he didn't finish it. And then the Bitcoin moment kind of fizzled out. I mean, yes, it's still going, but he hasn't done much with it. And then that's kind of it. I mean, he'll pop up on Twitter and post, but he hasn't done much since the Bitcoin stuff as far as like any theoretical work. He's not blogging as far as I know. So those are kind of the 6 trajectories. I'll just say this. Why do I think Nick Land is worth engaging with? It's thinking through this connection between capitalism and artificial intelligence. I think that thesis, capitalism is artificial intelligence, is incredibly worth reckoning with, thinking through, taking seriously. And I mean, you look around, and I'll tell you one of the reasons I do as a working class intellectual, whatever you want to call me, when my coworkers at the warehouse start talking about artificial intelligence, they open their mouths and Nick Land's views come out. They'll say stuff like, you ask them, well, what do you think about AI? They'll say, oh man, it's probably going to kill all of us. You're probably going to create some God intelligence that wipes all of us out. It's like the plot from Terminator, right? This is the kind of stuff they say. And you say, well, do you think that it could be used for anything good? In the way that like Ray Kurzweil is an optimist when it comes to this stuff. Like, oh, we'll be able to transcend our biology and we'll achieve immortality. We'll live forever because we'll upload our mind to the singularity. They don't see any of that. Like your average working class person is a total Landian. They don't think it's going to benefit us. They don't think we're going to transcend biology. They think it's going to wipe us out. It's going to be a complete system of control. And if you ask them, well, okay, that sounds like a nightmare scenario. Why don't we do anything about it? They'll say something like, well, you can't do anything about it. And you go, why? And they'll say, because it's part of the economy. And they're really saying Nick Land's position in this, kind of gut level intuitive way. And so, and it's not just one of them. And I've been very like aware. I'm not trying to lead them to say anything. I figured out like the basic questions to ask them. Do you think we can do anything to stop it? No. Why do you think we can't do anything to stop it? Because it's just how the economy works. And so when they're saying the Landian position on all this at a gut level, yeah, I think that's worth taking seriously.
Yeah, when you have people who aren't thinking about, political philosophical ideas at that level, but are saying things that are reflective of those very philosophical ideas, it is a sign that those ideas are an embodiment or at least, ahead of the zeitgeist, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of right there, I think, the rationale you just made for why study Nick Land. He's kind of a philosopher of this Terminator world we're in, of AI. And God, man, I really think the left is so behind on AI, not just in terms of like, studying it, but, or, I'm not even, I wouldn't ask them to say like you should support AI or like uncritically or whatever. That's not what matters. It's actually trying to understand it. And I noticed this kind of like dismissive view
I do
with a
too.
lot of leftists with AI. They're like, oh no, it's not that special. They're just like, it's just data analysis, but like more
I
advanced.
mean,
And
look, I'll give you,
have you used these things?
oh, I mean, a lot of the Marxists that I respect the most have this dismissive take on. I'll give you an example. Like when I was talking to Chris Catrone with Dave on Theory Underground, I asked him about this, and Chris's position is just like, this AI thing is hype. It's nothing we have to worry about. He's super dismissive of it, and I can't hold that position. I don't see it that way. And I think, look, Chris, I'm sure could give a good rebuttal to this, but for me, as far as I see it, it's almost like there's no good built-in Marxist answer to the question of AI. And it's like, so if you
I
have,
think there is though, and I think it's already
really,
in Marx.
well, I mean, you got to realize, like, Nick. This is the other thing I guess I want to say. When you hear that Nick's if I say Nick's a libertarian and Nick is a a diehard supporter of capitalism, the thing that gets lost in that is he's also a Marxist in a very specific way,
Mhm,
which is to say,
mhm,
and I asked him this on Twitter. He agreed. I said, Nick, the reason why you're an important AI theorist, and in my important, arguably the most important one, is for this very reason. It's because he has a Marxist interpretation of AI. And what I
mhm.
mean is this: Ray Kurzweil and Nick Bostrom and these other guys who have done this great stuff on AI. Here's the big thing: they do not think it through material conditions. They don't think it through the economy. Nick's the one guy who's actually thinking AI through the logic of the structure of the economy. And I think that's his great advantage over them. And that's why I think there's a lot we can learn from Nick is he understands the concept of structure. He understands especially that an economy has a fundamental structuring function in a society. And he's tying the development of artificial intelligence to that. And as far as I know, I don't think anybody else really has made those connections, and those connections resonate with me. I think there's something there. And
Mhm.
Bostrom and Kurzweil, it's like, oh, AI is something science is doing. It's cooked up in a lab. It's like Land's like, no, it's not. It's built in. When you go through the idea that the capitalist economy is based around quantification mechanisms, efficiency mechanisms, all these various things of commodification, quantification, efficiency, functionality, automation, automation, you start thinking, yeah, these are all things that start to explain why AI would develop out of this economy and not other forms of economy. That there's something unique about this mode of production when it comes to the production of artificial intelligence. And that's where I think he's at his best.
Well, yeah, because Marx really shows you not just how bad capitalism is, but how great it is at, transforming shit.
Mhm.
Like Marx and Jordan Peterson was so surprised to hear this when reading a bit of Marx for the first time in his life prior to the Zizek debate, was so baffled that like Marx praised capitalism's dynamism.
Mhm.
And I think s- you don't have to be a communist to appreciate Marx. In fact, I I made this point in a podcast with Jane Howard, a prof on Chinese history. And this is my view of why China is so good at capitalism. I think the Chinese government has been able to do capitalism so successfully, especially AI, especially AI. Like what China is doing with AI is insane. Like they are forcing America to get extremely better just by putting the next stuff out there like all the time.
Which
And
which
I think it's
which Nick predicted. One of his famous lines is
Mhm.
Neo China arrives from the future.
Right, and he moved to China for a
Mhm.
reason, right? It makes perfect sense why he's so fascinated by China.
Yeah.
I mean, China in many ways is more it's like some people think it's not really because of the government or whatever, but I mean, in many ways, it's more capitalistic at the level of how good it is at capitalism than, most countries are really.
Mhm.
And my view is that the Chinese Communist Party, I think, I presume most of them have read Marx, like the people in the high command, like read a lot of Marx. They're well-educated individuals.
Yeah.
And when you understand that, like, the basis that, like, essentially capitalism grows off of the extraction of surplus value, and that by having more the intensification of exploitation will actually make you way more competitive. It's almost as if the Chinese Communist Party realized they were like, okay, well, if what we're doing before wasn't working, we're going to try this capitalism thing out. What's the best way to do capitalism? Let's exploit the shit out of our workforce in the most brutal way imaginable. And I mean that make no mistake, folks, like the part of why China got so much foreign direct investment, it's not just like it's because they had the cheapest labor force and the largest labor force willing to work for low wages. And they did that by, having all the rural people go to the urban areas and work for very cheap, very low wages. And they're able to produce stuff at a level and work hard at a level that like most people just aren't in around the world. So it's like the Chinese working class is really producing tons of value, but it's like it's also exploited almost more than any other working class, except now that's changed a bit with like Vietnam and Indonesia getting into the picture and Bangladesh, right? But like China is accelerationist in this regard. They're very good at capitalism. And the point I'm trying to make here is just that I think Nick Land being a libertarian, and I notice people who are on the right who get attracted to Nick Land don't want to acknowledge Marx's contribution because they
Yeah.
see in Marx only like the communism and want to say, oh, well, Nick Land, it's really, he's only influenced by Hayek. And if that
It's
was
not
true, yeah, it's like if Hayek was the real genius of capitalism, not Marx, then, and Hayek, make no mistake, I think Hayek is a smart theorist in many respects. But like, if one takes a view of like equilibrium and capitalism having equilibrium, you don't really come out with capitalism as this dynamic, destructive system.
Mhm.
Really, only Marx and people like Schumpeter get that.
And
And
Schumpeter had a huge influence on creative destruction, right? Which
and yeah, and
really
Schumpeter
gets
is
from
super
Marx.
influenced by Marx.
Yeah, exactly. I think I quote both of them in the book, where I quote the Marx line about creative destruction, and then I quote Schumpeter. And this is the thing with Land, like, yeah, he doesn't like the state, and he certainly doesn't like the, the liberal state, but he's never denied the influence of Marx and the influence of, post-war French theory. Like, this is part of why he's original, whether you like him or not. He connected a bunch of different traditions together. He is informed by Marx. He is informed by Deleuze and Guattari, but he's also drawing from Hayek and Schumpeter and that side. And so he would say, look, like, when Marx is talking about how in a capitalist market, capitalists have to compete against one another. We'll use a simple example of capitalists who produce chairs. Okay, so if you're in the chair market, you want to get the majority of the market. You want to outcompete everybody else. Well, to do that, you got to cut costs. Well, the best way to cut costs is to make the production process more efficient, which is by investing in new forms of technology, right? So now there's a new economic motivation for people to create new forms of technology. Capitalists will buy them and apply them in their production process. And so Marx is understanding, like, look, technological dynamism is built into capitalist production in a way that it wasn't in feudalism or in, slave societies. People figured out how to do something. That's just how they did it forever. And more or less, there weren't any profound augmentations or developments in what they were doing in the nature of that labor. Capitalism is constantly changing. We do not make chairs the way they made chairs 200 years ago, right? Like, why? Because of technological dynamism built into the market, insofar as capitalists have to revolutionize the means of production to stay competitive. Okay. But then you take stuff like what the Austrian school and those guys were talking about, how there's a way that Land reads it, like what they were saying about markets are intelligence gathering machines. They're almost like AI because they have an ability to tell us things structurally, systematically, etc., that otherwise we wouldn't know. And so he views markets as forms of AI in and of themselves. And so, I mean, in the book, I talk about it. It's almost like this trajectory of capitalism producing an actual singularity, a super intelligence, or even artificial general intelligence, right? It's almost like you take this virtual mechanism of the invisible hand and it becomes a for itself. It becomes conscious of its, in whatever way we want to talk about AI being conscious, but it's almost as if it is an actualization of the virtual mechanism of the invisible hand, and that in and of itself was a kind of protoform of AI. And that logic, that structure is just going to develop itself technologically to the point that it gives rise to actual AI.
To clarify for the audience, I think the real philosophy of Nick Land versus the likes of Mark Fisher, right? Who's considered to be like the left wing accelerationist guy, author of Capitalism Realism, that book that seems to introduce so many people into theory.
Yeah.
And it's that part you write about transcendental miserabilism, which is, I believe, like a paper Nick Land wrote, right?
Yeah, it's in Fang
Uh,
Noumena. Yeah.
yeah, and Fang Noumena. And it's like the core difference as I see it is, to go back in history a little bit, because I think the historical context matters.
Mhm.
Historically, the competition over capitalism and socialism was because Marxism was the biggest challenge to capitalism ideologically. And then what ended up representing Marxism was Marxism-Leninism in the Soviet Union, unfortunately. But the way in which it was framed as capitalism versus socialism was like, who was actually more innovative and more delivering better outcomes. Many socialists actually critiqued this a long time ago, the idea of comparing capitalism on capitalism's terms,
Mhm.
like socialism competing with capitalism on those terms. But like, of course, Soviet Union tried to produce good commodities, like, and have its own commodity industry. It tried to have high living standards. And I mean, it made great progress, but at the level of like producing cool stuff, it just couldn't be capitalism. And that's ultimately why, the East Germany had to build a wall to prevent people from leaving to the West.
Mhm.
And the biggest complaint people had is like, there's this novelty that capitalism is able to produce with markets, and it's able to capitalize on infinite desires. It's just something that, it couldn't compete. It's also more innovative in certain respects too, right? There's all of these things. Now, like, there's part of the left that didn't accept this truth to the very end until the Soviet Union fell.
Yeah.
And then there's the other left, which, like the Frankfurt School, accepted that capitalism did win, but they were, they're like, okay, we need to do something, guys. We need to actually figure out a way of transcending capitalism into socialism in the West somehow.
Mhm.
And like Nick Land considers this view, which is the acceptance that capitalism has won, but that this outcome sucks, is miserabilism. It's like kind of a terrible worldview. And Nick Land positions his worldview as like an optimist almost, that like, I wouldn't say optimist, but it's more exciting.
The best way to think about it, he's very much a Nietzschean. It's a more fate.
Mm,
It's like this spirit of affirming your fate, affirming becoming.
mm,
And so while he does think capitalism is going to lead to human extinction, and the mean version of his is, oh, it's all going according to plan. Like he wants all of us to suffer. And that's not really it. It's more of him just radically affirming becoming, affirming the future, affirming change. And that's the very Nietzschean kind of existential disposition from which he's viewing this whole thing.
mhm.
But opposed to him is you got someone like Mark Fisher. Now, okay, so you mentioned Fisher. Let's talk about it. So, okay, if you go to Fang Noumena and you read the Transcendental Miserabilism essay, the beginning of it's been modified. What you have to do is contextualize it. It actually was a blog post Nick wrote in response to one of Mark Fisher's blog posts. And so Mark is like the transcendental miserabilist par excellence, because Mark's work was so focused on depression, especially the depression that comes from capitalist realism and hauntology and the lost futures, that whole thing. And so in a way, Nick is basically talking about Fisher there. But for Nick, transcendental miserabilism, what does that mean? Okay. He's taking the word transcendental from Kant, which means the conditions of experience. Okay. And miserabilism just means, being miserable. Okay. What he means by this, to cut through the technological or the technical jargon here, is just he thinks that leftists have a kind of experiential default setting that only views things in terms of, oh, it sucks. Everything sucks. Everything's unjust. Everybody's being exploited. Capitalism sucks. There's no alternative to capitalism. And that's what he basically, in straightforward terms, is meaning by that. And he thinks that that the transcendental miserabilist, the leftists, is miserable because they think everything sucks because capitalism sucks and capitalism shapes and configures all that is, right? And so for Nick, though, he just has this different view of time. Fisher was a student of Nick. He knew all this. He was there in the CCRU. He was writing all that stuff with Nick. He was co-author, if I'm allowed to put it like that, because none of them want credit for the collective writings. But I've heard Mark talk about this, where he's like, no, I had this point where, oh, I thought the future was just going to be radical change and nothing would be the same, and capitalism was going to blow apart all old traditions. And he's like, but I don't know. At a certain point, you start realizing, yeah, it changes stuff all the time, but goddamn, do things just remain the same and never go anywhere. And so there's this weird sense, right, where capitalism seems to be ushering in AI. I don't know if it'll be the techno-capital singularity. I don't know if it'll be super intelligence, but whatever AI is right now, actually existing AI and what it's going to be, seems like it's going to fundamentally reshape our world. But so that's the land side of it. Like, it's just going to keep doing these technological advancements that keep reshaping the world. But Mark would say, yeah, but we all go to McDonald's and we all go to Walmart and we all get force fed the pop culture and the movies and the music that we grew up on. And there's nothing new as far as pop culture goes. And it's all stagnating. And so it's like you have these two different temporalities that rule the social order at once. I mean, you can go with Nick or you can go with Mark, but for me, I guess I see there's truth to both. And it's this weird kind of contradictory, paradoxical social temporality of, you feel like nothing's stable and everything's changing. And yet you also simultaneously feel like everything's the same. Nothing ever goes away. Everything is a copy of a copy of a copy of the past. And we're just flooded with nostalgia, and it's the same restaurants everywhere you go, the same businesses everywhere you go, blah, blah, blah. Nothing's new. It's both at the same time. But for the two of them, they were at odds because, Nick's saying his view on time, social temporality is correct, and Nick's saying his is, or Mark's saying his is. But yeah, that's kind of the friction there. Is he thinks that Mark's view just makes a kind of default gloomy, pessimistic view.
You mean Mark Fisher, not
did I say Mark's? Okay, weird.
When you say you said I couldn't tell if you said Mark.
Yeah,
or Mark's, and the thing is, when you say Mark, it's confusing.
Fisher's, yeah, I should say Fisher's view. Yeah, Fisher's view is just inherently depressive and miserablest for Nick, and for him, it's in a weird sense he's the optimist, even though he thinks all of this culminates in human extinction. So it's a weird and that's part of the appeal of Nick's philosophy, is that it is a unique, singular position to hold. Like,
yes,
whether anybody likes it or not, whether you embrace it or want to fully reject it, he thought himself to a very unique position. And I think that's, Leibniz did that and Kant did that. Like, whether you agree or disagree is almost irrelevant to that question. The thing is, the vast majority of human beings never succeed at thinking themselves to a completely original view on the world. And the ones that do get remembered for it. Okay.
Good idea. Well, especially if you want to promote the book, what is always best is to have at least some decent engagement on the first half.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my view, honestly, of Nick Land's accelerationist stance, I believe they call it unconditional accelerationism, right?
Well,
like this kind of acceptance.
That's a different branch of, so there's UAC, or unconditional accelerationism, and there's zero accelerationism, which that's the accelerationist of James Ellis, the channel Hermetics. Love James's channel. You have different forms of it. Nick's, you want to say, well, what is Nick's? Like, to me, Nick's is right accelerationist, but the right has also taken accelerationism and interpreted it to their own thing. You have all kinds of, you have these like mass shooters who say they're accelerationists, and colloquially, accelerationism just comes to mean like the position that wants to make things worse in order to bring about a fundamental reshaping of society. That is not Nick Land's accelerationism. Is simply this: he wants capitalism to be freed up for it to continue to technologically advance as much as it possibly can in a ever amplifying cyber positive feedback loop. Like that's his whole thing is let capital bring about the techno future, right? That's his accelerationism. And for him, accelerationism really would be any strategy that effectively enables capital to do that. Like whatever makes acceleration of, see, whatever makes the acceleration of capital and of technological dynamism possible, that's what accelerationism would be. So if he thought that some sort of leftist politics would actually facilitate this process, he'd be a leftist. He just thinks that the way to free it up is through deregulation, less and less state interference, etc. And so this is why in the 90s he could have been interpreted as like some kind of wild leftist anarchist, even though he was championing capitalism. He was doing so in order to break state power and all of that. So that's like the Deleuze-Guattarian way of reading what he was doing in the 90s.
Yeah, I mean it's Deleuze and Guattari, right?
Yeah.
Have that sort of politics that is kind of proto-accelerationism, except that they're socialists, right? I mean,
Or what,
in Guattari's
whatever.
Guattari's case, communist.
Yeah, I mean, when you get into like what they specifically believed, I mean, there's this one of the great critiques of anti-Oedipus is the conspicuous absence of class in it. Like there's very much an absence of class in their analysis. Like I draw from their analysis all the time. I think what they were doing there is, philosophically and theoretically inspired, but I think the absence of class is, kind of a stain on it, at least a problem where you're going,
A big thing with French theory in general, like Foucault too.
That's where guys like, you have your like diehard Marxists who hate all this kind of stuff, like Gabriel Rockhill. I saw an interview with him
I don't hate Gabriel Rockhill, but I don't like what he says just because I think it's very simple.
No, and he can say whatever he wants. To me, it's dogmatic Marxism. He's
it's dogmatic Stalinism in my view. It's not even Marxist.
Yeah, fair enough. But this view that Baudrillard or Foucault or it's all just French PMC who are serving capital, and it's like, man, those guys, like if they were responding to a situation where they felt like you couldn't be a traditional Marxist anymore, so what do you do in light of that? Now, if traditional Marxists want to say, yeah, you can still be a traditional, fine, but they didn't think that was possible at that moment. So they were trying to think through the system in new ways. And for me, like an example, I think one of the issues with a lot of Marxists is how they leave media studies out of it. I don't think you can think our material conditions and make media forms some part of the superstructure. Media is completely hardwired, entangled in the means of production. There is no production without various forms of communication. And so this is just where I'm saying, like someone like Baudrillard, who's trying to think through capitalism in terms of signs and media. Somebody can say, well, it's idealism, but in reality, he's thinking through this core dimension of it. And so for me, every one of those guys made incredible contributions to thinking the situation. And I don't think our situation is identical to what the situation was in the 1840s.
So, to go back on this topic, so like back then, there were people who still, while accepting capitalism, thought that this capitalism, if it did accelerate, was going to lead to socialism, which is kind of, closer to the orthodox Marxist view, and that was like Marcuse's view, right?
Yeah.
And various Marxists, various Marxists still believe that. It's one of these kind of things that like I want to believe it, but I don't think it's just gonna like happen. You have to make it happen. I believe in agents of history, there's history is going to progress regardless of what you want, unless there's a intervention into history, which is what politics is. And I guess that's where I like Badiou a lot. But yeah, Nick Land thinks that that's cope. Nick Land thinks that that's cope.
His biggest complaint with left accelerationism is that leftist accelerationists, and look, I love the leftist accelerationists. I think Nick probably if we talked long enough about this, he would probably say I'm a left accelerationist, whatever. But I mean, okay, I'm not a left accelerationist in quite in the way that Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams are, or that Fisher was. I mean, I draw from all their work heavily, but I I I take Nick's point very seriously. And let me clarify what. Okay, Nick's point is that capitalism is the only system we've ever had that has spurred on technological development to the excessive dimension that capitalism has done. Soviet Union had a burst, or China had a burst, and now China in this new phase of Chinese capitalism, if you want to call it that, he's all about it. He thinks this is incredibly dynamic, but China under Mao, this kind of thing, he thinks communist societies could have a real incredible burst of development, right? And we saw this in the Soviet Union, but he's historically it always fizzles out, is what he thinks history has shown us. And that long-term enduring technological revolution comes from capitalism. And his criticism of left accelerationism boils down to, you guys have a mythological or phantasmatic, he doesn't talk like that, it's more Lacanian jargon, but you have a mythological belief or hope in some sort of technological dynamism, some sort of process that could develop technology even more fully than capitalism does. And he would say, but you don't have anything to base that on. Like, I believe in capitalism because we actually know that it produces revolutions in technological development. You guys want socialism, you want communism to do it, but you don't have, besides these little bursts that don't last very long and that end up fizzling out, you don't have a long-term engine of technological development the way capitalism does. You hope you have one. You wish you had one, but you don't have one. And that's his big complaint. And that's something I have to take serious, where I'm like, yeah, I mean, we can say, well, if the means of production were collectivized, then that would immediately lead to a super productivity. But Nick's point is like, yeah, and we can say, well, the means of production were never properly, really, truly collectivized in the Soviet Union or in China or blah, blah, blah. And yeah. But nonetheless, what has proven, stood the test of time when it comes to constantly engaging in technological revolution is capitalism. That's his point. And the counterpoint would be to say, no, here is the alternative form of technological dynamism, and it's this. And I don't think that any of us can give them that counterpoint beyond some sense of a hope in a future where there would be something like a blank, an X, that would do this better than capital accumulation. I mean, what do you think of that?
So I think he is right to say that the view that this is all going to amount to socialism, it's going to lead to the revolution, guys. Capitalism wasn't finished. I think that's cope. But I also think Nick Land's view is, at least the way I've seen people adopt it, is a kind of cope, because it's a way to say, well, you know what? Maybe this is going to destroy human civilization, but I'm going to enjoy it. Like, I'm going to enjoy it. I'm going to actually stay for the ride and, embrace it. Like, it's going to happen, and let's just go down for the ride. But I actually think Nick Land kind of overstates how innovative capitalism really is. I mean, it is very innovative. I don't want to downplay it, but I think, one thing that confuses me really is how he wants to eliminate things that like get in the way of capital. But I think there's some things that are actually anti-capitalist that actually accelerate capitalism. And this is overlooked by like libertarians and social democrats, but it's that trade unions kind of intensify automation, because when you have like more bargaining power with workers, that actually gives a greater incentive for factories to automate. And actually, my predictions, this is, you know, I don't want to, I could be completely wrong, because maybe actually jobs don't come back in any capacity, but some will. And this attempt at real industrialization by Trump's tariffs, I think it's going to lead to a huge surge in automation, because, all these companies that are accustomed to using cheap labor that now have to produce in America. I mean, you think they want to pay like decent wages?
No.
Of course not. So they're going to automate. And that might actually be better. So, like, in a weird way, Trump's sort of tariff policy, which is actually very anti-accelerationist, at least in the old sense, like in the sense that, you want to break down these restrictions on capital. I mean, they might actually accelerate it because in the sense of like AI, at least, because now it actually gives a real incentive for a greater incentive for companies to really ramp up automation. So that's sort of my thought on that. The other thing I was going to bring up, but this is a sort of something I was going to discuss more in the back room, but like, okay, Nick Land's hypothesis seems to basically be that like there is no system that's going to be more innovative than capitalism. Just impossible.
Yes.
Capitalism just is the best system at being dynamic and innovative. And one thing I will give him is I do think there will never be a system like capitalism that can meet desire.
Now, what do you
So
mean
like
when you say meet desire? What do you mean have in mind?
meet desire in the kind of dopamine sort of sense, like in the sense of having novelties.
Okay.
Like I just at least markets, maybe if we weren't to use the word capitalism,
Mhm.
markets are just so good at meeting desires in a way that I don't think planned economies ever will be. And I also think this is a bad thing. That's why I think people are like more depressed than ever and want to be protected from what they want. It's
Sure.
because the systems are so good at giving them what they want. I mean, like, Todd, of course, Todd McGowan is so good at writing about this and capitalism and desire.
Yes.
Now capitalism really controls us by, controlling our desire.
I'm saying it.
But
I'm saying it publicly, Tony. You have to have Todd on.
oh,
And you should
100%.
talk to him about that book in particular.
Yeah, I really like that book. That's a great book.
You guys would. I know you'd have a great discussion on that one.
So I do wonder, like, okay, if we were to accept this idea that capitalism is the most dynamic system,
Sure.
if we were to accept that, because then again, the socialists tend to think no, actually, socialism was what will create the Star Trek society, which will society will be more innovative when these technologies are owned collectively.
Mhm.
But let's say Nick Land is right.
Okay.
Does that put socialism as a conservative movement? And I've thought about this a lot. Maybe we want less change. Maybe there'll be a point, maybe we're past the point, but who knows, where actually too much acceleration of technology is actually bad.
Mhm.
And too much, radical change is bad. And socialism will almost be this like attempt to freeze history a little bit, if it can, assuming it can.
No, I think that's interesting. I think Nick would totally agree that socialism or communism, it's kind of the last stand against technological innovation spurred on by capital. I think he would see it as they're conservative in the sense of they're trying to conserve the human. And look, this other AI theorist, Hugo de Garis, wrote a book that influenced Land a lot called The Artilect War. And basically it just described this battle, this war in the future over artilects, which is like AI deities, right? Super intelligences. And the battle is between the cosmos, who would be the accelerationist types who are futurists, affirming change, affirming AI, affirming all this stuff, and the Terrans or the Earthlings, right? Who want to preserve something human, whatever that means, and that the human is worth fighting for. Nick thinks that any system that tries to control capital, regulate capital, get a hold of capital, make capital serve human interest. Now that's where I think you could maybe say that's the real socialist move, is whatever capital is, you're trying to bend it away from this impersonal logic of accumulation, right, into something that serves the collective good, that level of productivity, right? And he would say that's it's all conservatism because you're trying to save the human, and the human is what's on the way out. And whether it's through cyborgization, body modifications, all this kind of stuff, intelligence enhancements to our own brains, whatever we consider human we're going to cross a threshold. And I don't know what, in the book, I use the whole thing of the ship of Theseus paradox and the Sorites paradox. How many grains of sand do you have to put on a table before it goes from a bunch of grains of sand into a heap of sand? I don't know where the qualitative moment comes, but we know that there's a difference between grains of sand and a heap of sand. At some point, the qualitative shift happens. Same with this, cyborg process. I don't know Ray Kurzweil said that, like, I don't know how many nanobots we have to have, flowing through our bodies before we're not human anymore. But you would say that at some point you cease to be human. And so the battle for Nick is really a battle between it's the machine battle versus the humans is what it's going to boil down to. And anybody trying to fight for the human, conserve the human, will be the conservative side of this war. And so for Nick, he's going to take the side of the accelerationists or the cosmists who affirm the AI future and whatever AI has for us, and what it's going to, leave us behind in a way. Or, you're going to pick a side that maybe with the Terrans or the conservatives, and they're conservative just because they're trying to save humanity. That's what it will mean in this battle to be a conservative. If you're a humanist, you're a conservative. So that's kind of this mindset he has when it comes to it. And so he would say that, communism is this last hope in, large scale human emancipation. And in that sense, it's a conservatism, because the only thing that he said this in his interview with Justin Murphy, the only thing that he's interested in emancipating is the means of production, which is to say technology. He said he doesn't care about emancipating any humans or any specific groups or anything like that. It's just technology he's interested in emancipating. Now, look, all this we've been talking for a long time. Question is why? Why is he side with, like, if you want to say, well, shouldn't you only care about technology so long as it's making our lives better? And he would just say, no, like, this is anthropomorphism. It's you're presupposing that the human is something that should last forever or endure forever. It had its moment, just like how many species on this planet have gone extinct. What endures is the cosmos of, becoming, of change, and creative destruction. And something for us to be destroyed is okay, but something more beautiful is created out of us. That's his viewpoint on it. So it's still him. This is why I say, like, even him now, even though he doesn't use the term libidinal materialist anymore, that's what he is. He sides with matter being freed up to unlock new potentials. And I think he still is a libidinal materialist in that sense.
When Nick Land says that, like, okay, first off, this whole description you just gave just goes to show, one doesn't have to be, like, being a conservative doesn't mean right wing necessarily. And that I think a lot of people on the left have trouble seeing this. They see the word conservative as inherently bad, and they use, or inherently right is inherently bad. And Nick Land made me realize to some extent that I'm a conservative in a real sense. And, like, I honestly think that, I say that, not fully, but in a certain capacity, yes. In that I actually think, like, socialism's goal is to actually set order to the anarchy of the capitalist market. Now, I don't agree with him, though, that that was really what old socialism, actually existing socialism, was. I actually think what actually existing socialism, Soviet Marxist Leninist communism, had a lot more in common with capitalism, because it was trying to compete on capitalism's terms, and it was trying to have this kind of abundant society being so technologically efficient. It just didn't, win ultimately, but it was very much centered on this hyper efficiency ideology. In some ways, like, I think Adorno is really apt in criticizing the Soviet Union as, like, both the Soviet Union and state capitalism are, like, kind of totalitarian consequences of Enlightenment ideology on steroids, and I think there's a lot to that. And the Soviet Union, was it really conservative just because it, like, inhibited markets? I mean, I can see his argument in that respect, but, like, that wasn't so much ideologically, they were trying to do what capitalism did. It's not like they were trying to hold back history. The Soviet Union really saw itself as, like, jumping ahead of the West in this, like, battle for history. And, like, the reason why so many people believed in that is because for a certain point, so did the Americans. Like, there was this period, right? The was in power, and there was this time when the Soviet Union was beating America at the space race, and everyone thought that like the Soviet Union might overtake the United States. And there was a CIA report that actually predicted they would overtake them by the 90s. And they were mistaken, of course. But this was like the prevailing view. Now, another thing why I don't think this was progressive, this was conservative, is because Soviet Union actually pushed America to be better at capitalism. Like it made America, put so much money in innovation. Like a lot of these innovations that Nick Land seems to ascribe so much to just markets were really like facilitated also by the state, by the state and markets working together. Like perfect example is a smartphone, right? The smartphone phone is ultimately the Pentagon who helps develop the technology for that. And they do that as part of like, a war policy. And before that, the Americans really did like do all sort of things to subsidize capitalism to make it better than the Soviet Union. Like the creation of shopping malls was helped facilitated by the state. That's a real thing. And, so I think like if anything, capitalism got kind of less progressive after the Soviet Union fell because it had no more competitor, right? And less competitor, it didn't have to prove itself. It didn't have to be that innovative. And I think it went through kind of like this, I don't know, stasis up until recently. And this is what makes me think that like the progress of technology and capitalism isn't just a it's not always progressing. Like there's technological events in the Baijuian sense, in the way that there's political events, in the way that there's, love events, as he talks about, art events. Baiju talks about scientific events, and I think that's related to capitalism in a sense, because I think like AI, it seems like AI really progressed out of nowhere recently. Like it was in discussion for a long time, but everyone was like, eh. But then, ChatGPT is launched, and really it's about like what 2022 when the big leaps are made, and now ever since it's been exponential. Like every week there is a new super AI agent that can do crazy shit. So I wonder, like, capitalism as this dynamic system. I mean, to what extent is that also dependent on the creative inventions of just human beings? What if it's really actually is the human beings who are innovative? It's not this amorphous god of capital. Or maybe that's just my humanist cope.
No, so I mean, look, I wish I had the line memorized, but he basically says like what capitalism's doing is building itself into existence. And by that, he means the techno-capital singularity, superintelligence, building itself into existence through its enemies' resources. Basically, it's using humans and their forms of intelligence in order to produce itself is the way this process works. Now, this whole kind of weird, okay, before I go on, remind me to go back to events because I have something to say about that and I might lose. Okay. His logic, this whole thing of, the future is, pulling itself into existence, right? This whole idea of the future having an agency. This is one of these things that's hard for us to grapple with because you want to say the future is not itself doing anything. It doesn't exist in any meaningful way. For him, the true detective think time is a flat circle. For him, there's two modes of time. There's human time in the way that we organize it, which is linear temporality. There's a past, a present, and a future. We reside in the present. We remember the past. We project ourselves into the future. But for him, there's this other kind of time. Now, that what I just mentioned, this kind of linear temporality that we're all used to, that's called chronos for him. The other time is eon, and it's eternal time or virtual time. And for him, there's a sense in which all time is real and that we exist in this present moment, but the future is already real. The past is simultaneously actual, or not actual, but virtually real. And this gets into this, is it a block theory of time? Well, no, because it's dynamic, but there was a sense where the example I use in the book is you just think about a vinyl record. Okay. You can take, Prince's Purple Rain. If you got the vinyl and you go to listen to it, you put the needle on the record, you're only hearing the record at that specific moment. But the whole album is already there. It's all real. It's all there. It's just you can only hear a moment of it in a given second, wherever the needle is on the album. This is some kind of theory of time similar to that, where time, the future is actually real too. Now, another way to view it is to say that you take something like an actual concrete cyber positive feedback loop, a positive feedback loop, diabetes. All right. If you get diabetes, this positive feedback loop is going to amp up and blood sugar, and you know where this goes. And if nothing intervenes, if you don't get insulin, this is going to end in bad result. Right. Now, we already know that. Now, the moment that you have, the onset diabetes, you already know where this trajectory can go. So it's in that sense that the future is pulling itself into reality, where once a cyber positive feedback loop takes hold, if it goes on unchecked or unregulated, you know what the future is going to be. And it's in that sense, this is more of a concrete way of doing that. So there's this weird pull of the future, that the future itself has an influence on the present moment for land. Now, this doesn't have to be a constant though. Like what you're talking about with events. What the thing, he's not going to talk about events, but his wife, fellow former CCRU member Anna Greenspan, in her latest book, China and the Wireless Undertow, let me get this up here. She has this graph at the very beginning. What she's doing is wave theory. And these waves right here mark these incredible waves in technological innovation. Like it comes in waves. And so she's very much, her and Nick are very much aware of this wave capacity. And so, for example, there was this incredible wave in the potentials of online technology in the 90s. And this is why Land and the CCRU believed in the internet and in cyberspace so much, because they thought it opened up so many possibilities, that it was going to be a anti-identity space where whatever you are in your day-to-day life, you can go into cyberspace and totally decode and deterritorialize yourself, become something radically different, lose your identity and be anonymous, etc. And that basically cyberspace was this incredible reservoir of potential becomings, right? Where we could leave our old identities and our old traditions behind. And that was a wave in the 90s. When the Facebook era hit, that's what Nick calls it, what we started to realize, like, oh, cyberspace has been colonized by identity. Now everything's about our social media profiles and our narcissistic images on Instagram and everything we identify with. And he got so depressed because he thought that this virtual space was going to be this thing that could revolutionize us and free us up from our identities. And the wave crashed when social media became prominent, and it became the very opposite type of thing, where now your identity is primarily what you post on social media. And so this is incredibly depressing for him. The thing is, could there be a radical wave where cyberspace, the freedoms that it once had, it seemed like this new virtual wild, wild west, right? If you think about YouTube when it started, how you could post any video you wanted, and now try to post anything with a movie clip in it, and it's all, the algorithm flags it and you're copyright struck and all this. Could there be this wild, wild west return of the potentials of online virtual space? Maybe. But I mean, I don't know. I think we'll have to wait and see what the next wave is. But the point is, just to say, like, he doesn't talk about events, but he definitely is thinking in terms of these waves, or these, he talks about, convergent waves. And so he's very much aware of how things have a moment. And if the timing isn't right, or the timing's gone, then the thing itself is lost.
Okay. Before we go to Mencius Moldbug, Curtis Yarvin, the other neo-reactionary thinker who is kind of often put in the same camp as Nick Land, who has recently got a lot of popularity due to being interviewed by the New York Times, I want to address kind of an elephant in the room when it comes to Nick Land, which is
here we go.
a lot of people say, well, this guy seemed interesting back in the CCRU days, but didn't he become a raging racist? And it's like, yes, but reading your work was your part on that race question was interesting, just because my impression was he is a racist, but not in the way I thought he was.
Yeah.
He's like racist and post-racial, very weird. Can you help us explain what Nick Land's views on race are? Because goddamn, it seems bizarre.
Look, I mean, if you go look at his social media activity on Twitter, you're just gonna kind of view him as like an English MAGA uncle in a way, where he has he doesn't like people from third world countries going to England or France or America. So this kind of thing.
Doesn't he live in China?
Yeah, he does. He lives in Shanghai. And the odd thing about it, Tony, is that when you look at his social media activity, primarily all he does is focus on America. Like there's very little mention of China at all, which is interesting to say the least, right? You think he would
Because he probably can't criticize them the way he could criticize them in America, which is, I wonder what the anti-democratic NRX people think of that.
I don't it just to me it's an elephant in the room where I'm like, if you ever talk about China or Shanghai, like he doesn't mention it much at all. But he mentions America a lot and he mentions immigrants a lot. And that's where the racist comes in. The real question is, okay, there's what he posts that seems like typical xenophobic, which is funny, right? The guy who's supposed to be like the champion of the outside, the champion of otherness, is very xenophobic when it comes to immigrant. I mean, that's humorous to say the least. Look, the thing is with race, the race realism thing is he thinks his basic argument is your kind of typical race realist argument. He thinks that there are real differences between races that, leftists with their idea of equality just don't want to face up to these differences, especially in IQ, especially in intelligence. And this is a hard truth that leftists just can't cope with. And so they have to talk about equality. And so he acts like there's all this data that proves the level of intelligence, Asian people with the highest and white people with the highest, right? Like, yeah. We've heard this kind of stuff before. My thing is when I deal with it is, I hope it goes without saying, this is where I have my strongest disagreement with them. And it boils down to this. I just don't think this type of thing is what anybody who's ever defended equality really means. Oh, if you're a leftist or you defend equality, then you just can't recognize that there are statistical differences between different races or different groups. Nobody does this. I feel like it's a straw man argument. What somebody who defends equality does is say, all of us are human. All of us share a certain, even if you're an activist and you're not coming at it from philosophy and using this kind of language, what you're saying is that there's an ontological sameness between you, me, black, white, cis, trans, gay, straight, like, Asian, African, like there's a level of, we have the same type of existence. And by existence, I don't mean the world we live in or our cultures. I mean the most fundamental level of how we exist as such. And that's what we're talking about with ontology. And so I critique Nick because I'm saying, like, if you think that, let's do like the example I use in the book. Has anybody who's ever defended equality said, look, it is completely unjust that Prince could play the guitar better than so many of us? It's not fair. Prince must be stopped from playing the guitar. Nobody makes this argument. Prince was better at playing the guitar than the vast majority of us. Jimi Hendrix was better at playing the guitar than the vast majority of us. Stevie Ray Vaughan was better. Eric Clapton, blah, 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 right? Nobody's saying these musicians have to be stopped because it's not fair, it's unequal that they get so much talent. That's just not what it is. The idea is that certain human dignity should be given to everybody who's human. regardless of these kind of particular differences. And so what I try to do is I defend what I call onto-equality, which is to say that all of us in our mode of existence are the same. And, the book, the subtitle is a Žižekian critique of Nick Land. We haven't really even mentioned Slavoj much here yet, but I use Zizek, I use Lacan, I even use Heidegger, which maybe will surprise people who know Heidegger, but you can use Levinas, you can use Descartes, you can use Kant. There's different philosophers you can use to make this argument that despite our particular differences, there is a level of equality between all of us at the ontological level, at the level of our most fundamental form of existence. And that's where I critique Nick from. And so that sounds overly wordy. I know it's very jargon filled. I'll just sum up my position by saying I do not believe biology is ontology. I don't believe that biological facts about us get to the heart of what it is to be human. I'm not denying biological realities. I'm just not saying I don't think they're central to what it is to be human. And sure, somebody will say, well, human brains can only produce human subjectivity. Yeah, I know that. Nonetheless, when it comes to doing an ontology of what it is to be human, all of the characteristics that I have that make me human are shared by Black people and Asian people and trans people and gay people. And these type of things, when you work through them, you start to see the universal applicability of them. And so, yeah, I just don't believe that biological differences, even if you play the game and you say, okay, there are these statistical differences between groups. I just don't think that ascribes any sort of like essential difference between anybody, at that level. So I think it's a kind of straw man argument he makes against the principle of equality.
So what is his whole project? Because I know what your position.
Like, why does
is.
he care about this stuff?
Well, yeah, why is he so fixated, right?
So-
Because what does he mean by people say he wants to accelerate race war, and that how his theory of race is connected to his theory of the acceleration of capitalism. I mean, what's that about?
I don't know if I buy that. I don't know if look, I'm trying to say, I know that he complains about immigrants on Twitter. Is that some part that's deep in his theory, or is it something he does as, a rightist who gets jouissance from it? I think a lot of his Twitter activity is laced with enjoyment, right? Like he likes triggering or, so look, his whole point, because here's what I want to say. I don't think it makes sense for him to harp on racial difference. I don't. I think his philosophy, it doesn't make sense to do it within the parameters of his philosophical thought. And here's why. Whatever you want to call an identity, right? Especially if you're coming out of D&G, it's something that's very manufactured. It has a lot to do with, the forms of coding, the forms of identity registration within a given society. And identities aren't really anything essential about us. They're imposed on us by a semiotic regime. I know this sounds technical, but a sign system, a language, a culture, etc. It imposes meanings on us that aren't about anything essential about us. And Deleuze and Guattari, they're about deterritorializing, decoding these identities, escaping these identities. And Nick was always about escaping these kind of identities forced on us. That's why he liked cyberspace, to go back to us discussing that. He liked the idea of freeing up from our identities because he's a champion of difference, a champion of becoming. Out of nowhere, he kind of does this thing where it's like, oh, but there's this hard kernel of identity called racial difference. And you want to go nah, man, it D&G better than anybody. Like the way they talk about faciality and how, the white face was, globalized, spread across the and became the hegemonic face, right? It's arbitrary, it's contingent. It was it's not essential. It's not getting to something at the level of matter of potential, right? And so it's just a weird thing to harp on to me from his perspective. I mean, again, he can just say, well, it's a hard fact and leftists can't deal with it. Facts don't care about your feelings. Okay, Ben Shapiro, but like your ontology doesn't align with this well, is what I'm saying. And I've never seen him really deal with this where I'm like, your ontology, your metaphysics is one of radical becomings, radical changes, radical flux. And in these moments of identity are just contingent coagulations. Like this, I know it gets overly, but difference is primary, becoming is primary. And so to act like somehow one's ethnicity locks one into an essence of sorts is a really odd thing to sprout up in this metaphysics of change. And I just don't see it as consistent with it. And I also don't think anybody really measures equality on these type of metrics. I think the principle of equality is something that has to do with ontology again. That has to do with, I recognize in you that you are the same type of being that I am. Sure, you have, you have more musical ability, or I'm better at doing architecture or whatever. Okay, different people have different skills and talents, but they're still the same type of beings. And so for me, this it's just an odd glitch in his thinking. And you have different theorists that have really really properly critiqued this type of race realism. Stephen Jay Gould in The Measure of Man, right? Like, this classic work. And so yeah, this is the part. And so here's where Land does something with race though that I think is interesting. I think this is better with his theory, right? So on the one hand, he'll harp about race realism, but then on the other, he'll tell like white supremacists like that it's not going to work. Like, you guys are so concerned with trying to like conserve your white identity. White identity is not going to be conserved in the future. Nobody's ethnic identity is going to be conserved. And he goes, you guys are so big on thinking miscegenation that you want your grandkids to have the same type of facial features that you have. And he's like, you're thinking your whiteness, you need to think face tentacles. And what he means by that is you need to think what the radical potentials in modifying DNA, modifying our genetics, modifying our bodies, what kind of potentials are like, you're not going to even have human if this type of technology is free to develop. Like, you're worried about your race. Nah, like, humans will not, because people, when he says think face tentacles, he's thinking people are going to augment themselves to look like Cthulhu, right? So to me, this, and he calls this hyper racism. And there's an essay that he wrote called Hyper Racism. But here, what he's talking about is the racism that's going to come from those who are technologically and genetically modified, opposed to those of us who are just typical humans. I think that's an interesting, something to think about. How, you kind of see this kind of stuff in movies like Elysium. You have the elite up there on their ship in their space center, and you have the rest of the typical humans down here doing the work, right? So what he's trying to think in that essay is how technology is going to produce a race of technologically modified humans to the point that they basically aren't even humans. And then the non-modified humans are going to be oppressed by this new race of post-humans or transhuman, whatever you want to call them. But it'll be the elite who get this stuff first. And so the racism will be against those who are, traditional humans. So I think that's him thinking race in an interesting way. The other stuff that's just almost like, his typical social Darwinism kind of, it's not inspired, and, I just fundamentally disagree with it. But he would just say that somehow, like, oh, social Darwinism is Darwinism, and if you can't deal with that, then you're just a leftist who can't deal with truth or something.
Yeah, I always found it weird when people critique straw mans like that, like equality. Oh, you want everyone to be equal, or everyone is equal, and that there are no differences. You're just blind to the whatever. It's like, I mean, that's never what the argument was. Like, I mean, the liberal theorists made the best, argument for equality. I mean, like, social contract theorists like Hobbes, kind of the first people, really. Like, at the end of the day, Hobbes is like, during the scientific revolution, which is literally happening, he's like, well, if you cut two human beings in half and you look inside them, they're almost the same. There's not that much difference between humans at like a physiological level. I mean, some people are bigger, some people are stronger, some people are faster, but like other than that, this idea of like essence, higher essence, because like of course aristocratic societies believe like aristocrats are like more divine than the plebeians, and he's like, well, don't see it. That kind of becomes the basis for it, and that's how, I still think like the basis of equality now though is like dignity. So this critique of like, oh, the left thinks that, yeah, it's odd to me. But what's weird about Land's kind of post-racial racism seems odd to me is that like he is acknowledging what he thinks are these like objective hard truths of race realism, but also doesn't buy the whole white nationalist concern for preserving the race, like Richard Spencer or someone like that would, or Nick Fuentes. And it's funny to me because like it does seem like the when it comes to race differences, what is lost is the obvious fact that both like humans in general are threatened. And it's not just AI, but like if we look at capitalism and disintegrating tradition, the classic example is like Muslims and Christians get pit against each other all the time. And the neocons are obsessed with the death of the West and the threat of Islam. But it's like at the end of the day, what has been declining in general is religion, period. Like it's a general secularization trend and a decline of communities, which communities really build religion in any meaningful sense. I think without community, which you don't really have religion, you have like spiritualisms. You have forms of spirituality, which is like what is the dominant sort of religious thinking of today. And it's not religious. It's a big difference. Like spiritualism is like the belief in, essentially a kind of irrational belief in things that you cannot prove, the divine forces of nature, but it's minus the literal core of religion, which is, in Latin, religere, to bind. That is where religion is in substance. And there's huge decline of that. And that's technology and, the progress of capitalism, really. Now, it's funny to me that, like, Nick Land doesn't seem to give a fuck about the human period as to what happens, yet it will acknowledge these like hard truths. And now, where does Moldbug and like Neoreaction come in? Because Neoreaction is kind of what really seems to bring this whole thing really into explicitly right wing dimension. Because like Nick Land writes The Dark Enlightenment, right? And this is, correct me if I'm wrong, what inspires Yarvin to kind of take it in Neoreaction to a whole direction with like this Dark Enlightenment project, right?
So yeah, I mean, look, there would be no Dark Enlightenment series of blog posts. It's published as a book now, but it was a series of blog posts. That would not exist without Yarvin's influence, and I think this stuff on race it's also influenced by Yarvin. Yarvin in some ways also like a race realist or something. And I mean, look, I mean, because he wrote How Dawkins Got Pwned. Right now, what's he talking about with Dawkins? Well, the issue with Dawkins is that despite his, radical new atheism, that, he would say he rejected Christianity. What Dawkins wasn't aware of is how he still remained honed by Christianity because of he was a secular Christian. He still believed in like these principles of equality and all this kind of stuff, but he did it from a level of secularism. But nonetheless, those are principles from Christianity. And so if you believe in the equality of all people and that races aren't different, blah, 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 right, then you're adopting a kind of Christian perspective. So even if you want to have your, strong critique of Christianity, if you don't realize that you're a Christian when it comes to your moralism, then you're being used by Christianity in a roundabout way. So, you know, same thing like with Yarvin, as far as I know. And so, look, no, Yarvin, the real influence there is, I think we've kind of talked about it. It really is this soft core thing. What I'll add to that is, like you mentioned, how the New York Times discussed Yarvin recently and kind of put him back on people's radar. For the first time ever, I saw Slavoj Žižek back in March. I was at the LAC conference in Columbus, Ohio, and I saw Zizek give his keynote speech. And in it, it was the first time I'd ever seen him mention Curtis Yarvin. And so he goes on, he says a few things about Yarvin and how he thinks it, it relates to Trump's presidency. And then I actually got to ask him a follow-up question about Yarvin and what he thought about the Soft Corp. And his whole thing is like, man, these like, what is it? I'm drawing a blank, the East Dutch Company or one of these.
Dutch East India Company.
There you go. Thanks. He was like, look, that was like a soft corp. Like this concept of the soft corp isn't nearly as new as Yarvin is acting like. I mean, that corporation, that
True.
yeah, like they
Good
owned,
point. Yeah, they ruled over India.
yeah. And he's like, and they were incredibly oppressive. Like their torture methods were obscene. And so he's like, look, I don't think this is actually new or profound. Like this has already been tried and it resulted, terrible effects on people. And so it's just interesting to me, as somebody who's so inspired by Zizek, to see that even Yarvin's on his radar now. But basically, for this critique of the soft corp, like, I'm sorry, I think most of us would agree that letting your job have even more power over you, that you never actually leave your job. You live in your job because where you live is everything is owned by your job. You rent a place within your job. I might as well, like at the warehouse, have a little, one of the, a little pallet to sleep on, and I just never leave. Right? That's what the soft corp becomes. You live and breathe inside your job, and somehow and the image of this is like, okay, you don't have any. It's not about individual freedom. Land and Yarvin don't care about that. Not about individual flourishing. What the soft corp promises is greater security. And so Yarvin would be all about, an insane level of surveillance to ensure that there's no crime. And look, I'm just a Baudrillardian on this. Baudrillard has this great quote. I'm paraphrasing, but he's like, his point is like a society that would be actually capable of eliminating all possibility of terrorism is the most terroristic thing you could imagine. The level of control that you would have to impose to ensure this kind of thing never happens would make it a complete form of oppression. And so, oh yeah, you'll be safe in the soft corp, but it's not about your individual freedom. It's not about your voice. It's not about, participation. It's you living at the place you work and consume, and that's it. And even if you want to say like, well, we actually, we go home and, we get ready to go back to work and we consume at home. We watch Netflix. Yeah, well, that formal distinction between home and your job, there's freedom in that. I understand like work needs to be done, but if you collapse that freedom and that you literally just live in your job, I would prefer not to.
That was almost a good segue for Timenergy. But the thing is, I want to, because, people who are Moldbug fans might be like, well, you just critiqued it. You didn't explain the theory. So I do want to give you an opportunity to kind of explain his worldview because, from my understanding is basically Curtis Yarvin, Mencius Moldbug, his view is that what he believes in is a sort of system where ruled by a board of directors who essentially choose a monarch, kind of like a corporation, that the government is ruled like a corporation and you have the board of directors choose a monarch and the monarch rules. But for him, this takes place at a city level. So it's not like, all the systems will be the same, but rather his vision is a bunch of different cities ruled by monarchs, like capitalist monarchs, right? You know, like what is the point of this? Is this not an esoteric doctrine to justify just dictatorship, right-wing dictatorship in the current system? Is the kind of idea that, oh, this is just a city level, a way to kind of hide the real agenda. I ask this just because, there is now liberals are convinced that J.D. Vance is very inspired by Curtis Yarvin. And, before you go off, my hunch is that New York Times and Yarvin are kind of using each other for popularity. And that like Yarvin benefits from this idea that he's closer to the Trump admin than he actually is, because it makes him seem important. And on the other hand, for New York Times, who are anti-Trump, they get to, do the whole thing where to say, well, there's a scary far-right agenda, which I think there is. I just don't know if Yarvin really plays a role in that. But kind of, can you elaborate on what Curtis Yarvin believes? Because he's very popular these days. He is becoming genuinely popular in a lot of tech circles.
Yeah, I think the thing to add to this discussion is I haven't used this term yet, but what he's about is the patchwork. Now, what the patchwork is, I've talked about the Sovcorp, but the patchwork is a patchwork of Sovcorps. So these little like mini corporate states, right, that he has in mind, let 1,000 mini Sovcorps bloom, right? The idea is for there to be a whole range of options of different corporate states to live in as a consumer. And the point is that they would have to compete for residency. Like his logic is that the Sovcorp that could outcompete the others, which is to say provide the best standard of living, would be the one that gets the most profits, right? And I think this is what Nick likes about it in principle. Nick likes fragmentation. He likes difference, the escape of difference. This comes out of his Deleuze-Guattarian thing. Like D&G wouldn't like this whole thing, but he likes it for Deleuze-Guattarian reasons of his own, right? And he thinks that whereas the global agenda, which is impose liberal democracy everywhere, which for him is this imposition of the same, he doesn't like that. And what he likes about Yarvin is that the patchwork theory of have as many corporate states competing against each other, they would have to all, in some sense, offer difference. They would have to define themselves differently, which is to say, create different types of societies. And that's, as far as I can tell with Nick, that's just an end in itself. Like the escape of difference, the fragmentation of becoming, and that's what he likes about it. And I think what it does is for Yarvin is it just lets capital have different societies, different cultures to do its thing in. So it's an opportunity for capitalism to do different things because you have a plethora of different mini corporate states that have to find some way to define themselves and outcompete others.
Okay, yeah, this is kind of what the picture I got, and you did explain this in that chapter on Moldbug. Where I'll be honest, I still think this is where we'll get into some critiques, and you can let me know what you think and if these are off base or not. But I don't know, I kind of still think like Yarvin's vision especially makes no sense to me. And why I don't think it makes any sense in that I actually think it's kind of like the right-wing version of anarchism, in that like, left-wing anarchists want to start their projects and their vision is like a bunch of different anarchist autonomous zones, all doing their thing. And his idea is that, but like these corporate capitalist states, obviously very different, completely different visions. But why I compare it to left-wing anarchism is because I think it's like this utopian post-political vision, because it's like post-political because, I think it appeals to people who don't really want to engage with existing politics. So they're like, if only we just built a city somewhere else and, made life better here, except, you need tons of money to do that. Now, this brings me to the big contradiction in his whole vision, is how does Curtis Yarvin's vision account for combined and uneven development? Because if there's, tons of different cities, right? They're all there, these capital cities, and they have to compete. Well, it wouldn't take very long for the capitalists to just all go to one place, and that's kind of what happens in countries. In countries, there's always some cities that are super built up, while the rest of the other cities aren't. And it's literally because money goes where money goes. This is what Marx was saying about uneven development. Because, as you know, like when people invest in a region, then people go to that region for jobs. It's a reciprocal effect where then you go invest money where there's already money, and you sell things to people where people have money to buy it, and you get that. And I don't really see how, like, this idea of a bunch of corporate city states wouldn't just end up, wouldn't end up as just like one or a few big corporate city states, and the rest would implode. Like, so it just seems a little odd to me how this would function. It's also like, how would this start? How would this even happen in the existence of the current world? Like, given the current geopolitical reality we have now, how would this even happen without people with tons of money starting these states? And then if that requires all their money, what is stopping, like, the people with money just taking their shit into other states? Because you look at, like, what are the real world examples of Yarvin's idea? There's not many. I mean, I can think of like Dubai, Qatar, oil money, right? Well, so okay, so two things where I'm leading to. So like Singapore would be an example of like a city state that is kind of like a corporate city state, and it is close, and it's not a coincidence why Yarvin seems to talk so highly of Singapore. He always likes to say, well, Lee Kuan Yew is a example of a dictator that, is well liked. There's examples of well liked dictators. And I think, well, like, what he's missing there is a whole dimension of culture. Because you can't just have like a city state of like, that's ruled by corporate overlords and have a society actually function and have people want to do work for these overlords without coercion. Because that's another thing. He seems to think that, like, because it's a city state, people will be consenting to live there and consent under the rules. So it's not like coercive in the way that the modern state is, in which you don't really choose to consent. You only give tacit consent. Well, okay then. Like, the thing about someone like a country like Singapore is that it's a country, it's a nation state. It's not just a city. Like, it's a nation state as much as it is a city, and that culture holds it together. Like, culture is a very powerful, and having like a municipality and like a province and a country stick together. It's that identity, and you can't just like create that out of nowhere. So like, I'm trying to think of examples to build this like whole city state, corporate city state thing. People were inspired by Yarvin. Well, like, I don't know if you heard of Prospera in like Honduras. It's like this attempt to build basically like a corporate utopia in the middle of a country, and they have obstacles with the government. They blame the government for why they can't succeed. But it's like, okay, how do you actually build a society without culture? And that's the kind of thing that I feel like is just so there's just so much stuff that feels like maybe I'm just like not being charitable enough, but I feel like there's just so many things not considered in Yarvin.
But it's just as far as like, couldn't one of them market themselves like this is Christian land? And then you get, I mean, even the racist, like, this is white world. Like, I mean, they could actually use this to market themselves as a specific softcore. Now, the capitalist argument against like doing anything like white supremacists, as far as a softcore goes, you just limit your customer base. It doesn't make sense to do that. But yeah, and like if you do Christian world, aren't you limiting? Muslims aren't going to want to live there. Yeah, and so there's the market tendencies to like deny these kind of impulses. But I'm with you on the whole problem of maybe the idea is like spontaneous culture would be generated. Just to say, like, how would it get started? I mean, Yarvin's whole thing is you use typical election process against itself. You get someone like Trump who wins an election, but then immediately declares a state of emergency and then begins the restructuration process that way. Yarvin said this much. So that's the how is, and it's funny. This is why people are like, oh, Steve Bannon was obviously influenced by Yarvin, maybe Land, but Yarvin in particular, because it's like, get a charismatic capitalist, have this person have like some sort of authoritarian mindset, and use the election process to win, and then start to destroy democratic process from within once you've won the election. It seems like Yarvin informed that playbook on some level.
There's also a few things from a pure statecraft like perspective that don't make sense there either, because I feel like this vision would only make sense, one, if it was actually the state's finances were funded by the capitalists, who founded them, like, this money, which would mean that state is subject to capital flight determining its finances, which would make it very precarious and
But if
unstable.
Trump had been more of a monarch, he is a capitalist, right? He could have. Oh, now everything has to serve the Trump business. Like, I don't know. Like,
No, but what I'm talking about is like the founding of a new city state, because like how most city states actually, because what I'm trying to say is that if it's founded by like people with a lot of money, they have to have tons of money and stable money for it to work, like, oil money, etc. Or else you have to do what every other state in the history of the world does, which is they create their currency out of nothing and they impose a tax, which gives it value. So now people have to pay taxes, and that's what gives the currency value. And that's what a state is. It's like, it rules by coercion, because like, why would people use a currency that is created out of nothing? Well, it's because you have to pay taxes now. Now that sort of undermines the whole point of these city states, which is people like, freely moving into them because they're free of coercion. And like the other big thing is like military. What is stopping like other city states from invading other city states, and how do you get a strong military to either prevent that
the
from
idea,
happening?
I think what he would try to argue is that any state that pulls crap like that will lose its reputation so fast that it'll collapse, something like that. What I hear in all of this, Tony, is that you're soon going to be making a one-dime critique video of Curtis Yarvin.
Oh no, maybe, but I don't know. It's not very high on my priority. It's just that I've met people who are really into Yarvin, and these are questions that.
Can I tell you my biggest issue
Yeah.
with the whole thing? I think they undervalue the role of ideology in the functioning of a society. Can you imagine the capitalists not having the state to blame for all of their mishaps and what goes wrong? They no longer can use the state as their ideological scapegoat, because they themselves are the state. So anything that goes wrong, they have to take responsibility for. And I don't think any capitalists are ready for that. They need the state as an ideological mechanism to blame for why the economy sucks, or why prices are too high, or inflation, and blah, blah, blah. It's always the state's mishandling of things. And if they have to take full on responsibility as a corporation for them, where's the ideology? Then I guess the only thing is they could try to blame other soft course, but then that leads to a lot of problems. And so I don't know. I think Yarvin, I mean, I know for a fact he doesn't know ideology theory the way that, someone like Zizek does, or how ideology really functions. And it's like, sorry, Curtis, this whole conflation, this identification of capital and the state, you don't know how much capital needs this split, or this disidentification between itself and the state, for it to ideologically manipulate the situation, and always blame the state for the mishaps in society, and never capital itself.
That's a really good point. And also, like with ideology, I mean, that's such a big factor as to why people obey, why people serve the military. And you need a strong military if you don't want to prevent your city state from being invaded. And without ideology being this force that, is necessary for getting people to obey the system, well, how else do you actually create a legitimate military that's willing to serve you? Well, I mean, in the old days when there was these kind of, what's really interesting to me is Renaissance. These guys love city states so much. They should look at the Renaissance. The Renaissance city states were anything but stable. And I mean, Machiavelli writes all about that. And, part of how like city states, and also just not just city states, but for a large period, monarchies actually would maintain power and control was just by promising the people who are fighting for them, basically. Like, okay, well, if we invade these guys, we're going to get a bunch of gold and silver and women. There's all these kind of like very just basic motives for that. And so it's like, well, that's going to be how you're going to incentivize having a military. Well, that's just a recipe for all these states invading each other, because, or without that, the only way to have a legitimate state, like a legitimate military, is to have strong ideology and legitimacy, where people obey voluntarily, not just by like their financial gain, right? So there's just so much there that is missing. Look, the only way I can see this vision playing out, like the only way I think Yarvin's vision makes any sense, is honestly what China is doing now. So China is like a super big state, but it's a national nation state, highly centralized, but it allows for decentralization, and it allows different provinces to experiment with different systems, and even different cities to experiment with different systems. Like, I forget what it is, it Chongqing and Guangdong. My pronunciation is horrendous, but basically these are like two systems that are often compared with each other. One of them, I believe, is Guangdong, is the more socialistic one, you know? And then there's Chongqing, which is like hyper capitalist, kind of, like Hong Kong a little bit. And they're comparing as to which one is better for X or Y, Z. I can see that making sense. And that makes sense because you have the central government there to like make sure that, like, these aren't separate states with separate militaries, with separate complete authority structures that could potentially, invade each other. Like, that might make sense. I think could make sense. I could see that happening in America, given how decentralized it is. But other than that, this idea of the corporate city state, is a kind of a fully autonomous. I don't quite see it. And to be honest, it seems like it makes so little sense that I do wonder if what Yarvin is actually advocating maybe is my Straussian overanalyzing the esoteric messages of things. But perhaps what Yarvin's really doing is he's trying to make the same argument that Carl Schmitt made for dictatorship, but except he doesn't want to make it overtly. So he says, well, no, it's just about, cities. And so there's consent.
Yeah,
Because
but when he uses the term capitalist monarch, though, I mean, using this term like first off, I mean, the CEO of a corporation is qualitatively different than the old structural position of a monarch. But somehow he thinks like, oh, well, it's the monarch is appointed by the board of directors and not through blood lineage. So somehow, but like, man, that's almost where the similarity stops. But this idea of, just a center of absolute power, incredibly different motivations behind both, as far as I can tell. And I'll say, look, I think my issue with it, the problem I see is that, okay, you'll have a patchwork of monarch or a patchwork of soft corps, but trust me, there's going to be cooperation and communication between them. So if one soft corp registers an individual as problematic, as a troublemaker, you better believe there's going to be some sort of shared registry that lets the different soft corps know this person is a problem. They're violent, or they don't follow the rules. They're rebellious, and the question is, what happens to the individual that no soft corp will accept in as a renter, producer, consumer? What happens to that person? To me, it leads to something like the Demolition Man scenario. You've seen Demolition Man, one of my favorite sci-fi movies from being a kid. In it, you have these the rebels who basically have to live in the sewers, and they eat rat burgers because they don't have anything else to eat, led by Dennis Leary. And basically they're just the part of no part. They're not part of society. There's no place for them to go. And so this is the question that, and Yarvin has, there's people like this and they don't fit, the world in which we've constructed, then I'm sorry that their existence is inconsistent with reality. It makes you think, like, when you read stuff like that, it's like, oh, you're just talking about killing, or, I mean, He doesn't come out and say it, but it's like, okay, well, if you don't fit, if you're a troublemaker, if you want a different form of society other than the Sovcorp, then sorry that you're not, your beliefs and your views are not consistent with reality, which is the reality of the Sovcorp. So yeah, I don't, but again, because the liberal in me wants to go, well, where does individual freedom come into play here? What about the right to self-expression? What about the right? Like, they don't care. It's not about that. It's not about the thriving of the individual. They don't care. It's about security and a well-functioning society. And for them, you know, the Starbucks functions better than the DMV. And that's their, the basic argument is that state-run institutions are bureaucracy and it's a mess and it's inefficient, and capitalist run institutions function smoothly. And it's like, let's do that to the state is their mindset.
Right. Doubling down on the capitalist realism.
This is their attempt to do something new with capitalism as a new mode, because there's no, and that's the thing, right? Like, if you identify capitalism with the outside, like land does, then there's nothing outside the outside. There's nothing outside of, the radical alterity that capitalism floods the world with. I don't think I want to limit the outside to capitalism, but that's just me.
I brought up Carl Schmitt there when comparing Yarvin, and I do want to elaborate as to what I mean by that, because, Yarvin ultimately advocates, yeah, for a corporate dictatorship. But the way he kind of makes his vision seem less scary is by saying, well, it's, it's going to be city states. It's at this level, and it's not like a permanent, it's the board of directors, and there's consent. It's not necessarily tyrannical. And he likes to use city states also an example of it working well, because it's easy to use city states of it working well. Hence why I compared him to a left-wing anarchist, because left-wing anarchists like to always say, well, look at Catalonia, look at Rojava. This is our example of libertarian communism in practice. Well, I think Curtis Yarvin's real agenda is to have a corporate, dictatorship for America, for like a, like at the national level, not just at these state levels. And I say that because he always brings up Roosevelt's declaration of to Congress that essentially asked Congress to give him tons of power to do what he needed to do during the Great Depression and World War II. And then, he's not the first to say this. This is, their imperial presidency. Arthur Schlesinger, this is an old historian, made this point about the American presidency is dictatorial much more compared to parliamentary democracies. Now, I say Carl Schmitt because Carl Schmitt made a similar argument against democracy and for dictatorship that Yarvin makes. And in fact, Yarvin's case, that sounds new to a lot of people these days who are, getting new into political philosophy. It's not very new, but it goes along these lines. Basically, Yarvin always says, well, democracy is not very effective, first off, and it's also not very democratic. When you think about it, who really makes decisions? It's bureaucrats. It's the cathedral. It's elites. It's people with money and power, which, by the way, is, largely true. Now, he makes this argument about why democracy is actually not very democratic, but how democracy is also too dysfunctional because we can't decide anything. But what we need is a dictatorship, and dictatorship isn't necessarily anti-democratic because it can better meet the interests of the people, the will of the people, the desires of the people, because it can act fast. Now, that is precisely what Carl Schmitt made as an argument for dictatorship, in the 1920s, which ended up being used by the Nazis. He was a Nazi, Carl Schmitt. And it's a very similar case. And in fact, he made the same case way more compellingly than Yarvin does, I think, because he really, in the crisis of parliamentary democracy, makes the point that the very foundations of parliamentary democracy actually have very little to do with democracy. It has to do with parlement, speaking with each other, just settling differences between classes. Really, what we don't have is democracy. We just have endless discussions, between elites. And what we just need is one government that can represent the people and act fast. But what that really ends up doing in practice, as history has shown with with dictatorships, is that rather than a dictatorship that might meet the interests of the people, which it sometimes can, often comes to power by promising that demagogues, what it usually just ends up being is the championing of one elite over all other elites, as opposed to what exists now with, corporate bourgeois democracy, is multiple competing elites being able to influence the system. So like what I see Yarvin is doing is like he wants he says he wants like the state to be run like a corporation, but it's really ultimately going to be one faction of capital in practice if it's a dictatorship. Like imagine if Elon Musk and Trump, like Elon Musk was to become the new monarch and completely rule fully. Like that would be his kind of vision. And I think like, I don't know, man, like all this sounds very exciting, but it just seems like basically what Carl Schmitt, the Nazi, was saying, minus the socialistic component. Because the Nazis were to, appeal to socialism, they would say, we need a collectivism and all that. Whereas Yarvin is like that vision minus the socialist part, you know?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the thing that we got to be aware of right now is there's so much lack of faith in the democratic process. I think a lot of people do have, and this is, I try to approach things in this Lacanian Žižekian perspective a lot of the time. I think there is a libidinal or phantasmatic appeal to the image of the strong man, of the phallic man, use our terms. But the point is, it's precisely this: is the appeal is that we're at a bureaucratic deadlock. It's gridlock. We can't get anything done. No consensus can be formed. What if some exceptional figure came in and was able to cut through that and just impose his will in order to do things? Oddly enough, I just saw Slavoj Žižek do a talk where he says he finds this appeal in this idea, in this image, because democracy is so broken down at the moment. And so I think, from my perspective, the way I approach it is just to understand, like, there's a deep appeal to this at this moment, to any kind of figure you think could come in and hack through the gridlock of democratic process. And so I would try to think through, like, okay, what are the risks involved with this? I mean, can democracy in any way respond to this? Is this a kind of like temporary destiny because democracy doesn't have a good answer to this? I would try to think through it in these kind of ways.
All right. So I'd like to 360 the conversation back to where we started, which is the theme of your book. Let's go at the title, Capital versus Timenergy, a Žižekian critique of Nick Land. And, Nick Land kind of resembling the capital, Timenergy resembling your ideology and Dave's ideology from Theory Underground. Because I had Dave, some listeners might remember Dave from Theory Underground, to discuss his book called Timenergy way back almost a year ago, it feels like.
Wow.
Yeah, when it was coming out, when he had the Zizek edition first come out. And yeah, so what is the central conflict of your book, this Timenergy versus capital? What is Timenergy? Like, what is the central point you're trying to really make with this conflict?
Sure.
Like, what are you trying to advocate?
Okay, so it's this weird thing, right? So Dave McCarricker, this is the book right here. This is what started it all. Timenergy, why you have no time or energy, right? So, and in a sense, like, yeah, his book, my book, they're kind of the first two main works written on Timenergy. And so here's what's going on. Dave's the first person to figure out this relationship between time and energy, especially in a kind of existentialist register. What I mean by that is, you think it through, if you have time to do things that you care about, that give your life meaning, but you don't have the energy to do those things with the time you have, then you don't really have your time. Can't utilize your time in an existentially meaningful way. And if you have energy to do things, but you don't have enough time, things are, in your schedule, then you don't really have that energy to invest in the things. Like, so the point is to think time, energy, just as that, as two things that are actually one, right? And so instead of doing the time and energy thing, which, it's colloquial. People will say, I don't have the time and energy to do that, time or energy. But this connection to realizing how existentially speaking, you don't have time unless you have your energy, and you don't have energy unless you have time. This is his profound concept building, right? This idea that you have to start thinking time and energy together. Now, as easy as that sounds, to put the two words together and, time is your energy and energy is your time. There's so much philosophical work that can actually be done once you make this connection, because the existentialists were all about time. Heidegger, Husserl, Sartre, all of those guys are thinking temporality, or whether it's transcendental temporality or existential temporality, they're thinking time. None of them really start to think about how energy bears on this, right? And honestly, I don't know if you've had the experience. I've had the experience of extreme exhaustion in my life. Really, I only had it once. I mean, yeah, I'm tired often, but like real exhaustion, right? Where you can't even like lift your arm. You're that zapped, right? In modes of extreme exhaustion, and even everyday exhaustion, you just can't really think past much of anything. You're just locked into this moment of this, like, it's like a forever present, right? The future breaks down. And so it's only when you have an abundance, a surplus of time energy, that you start to be able to go, okay, here's what I want to do that's meaningful to me. I want to learn other languages. I want to learn Kant's philosophy. I want to learn how to play an instrument, right? You things that require dedication and repetition on an everyday level that go beyond, it can't be hobby temporality. Oh, I do this for 30 minutes once a week. If you really want to learn how to play the piano and be able to play, Beethoven and Debussy and Rachmaninoff, you're going to have to play the piano more than 30 minutes a week. So the kind of things that really matter to us, that we find intrinsically meaningful, most of us don't get to do. And why do we not get to why do we not have time, energy to invest in these kind of things that can lead to the life of passion? Because that's what I should say. Time, energy really isn't an end in itself for us. It's not like, oh, we have time, energy, mission accomplished. The point is to see time and energy as the condition of a life of passion. And by life of passion, I mean the type, getting to do the thing or things, but usually a thing. For me, it's philosophy as much as it can be. It's the thing that you want to get out of bed every morning and do again, because you find it rewarding. You find it gives your life meaning, and you find you don't get sick of it. Right. And the biggest hindrance to, one, having time, energy, and two, living a passionate life, is wage labor. And what forces us into wage labor? Capital. So this gets to the heart of the capital versus time, energy thing. That we have a mode of production that takes our time, energy as this dynamic of our existence, and it commodifies it and turns it into labor power, right? And so this is why I don't like viewing, time, energy is just another name for labor power. No, labor power is a specific modification of time, energy. And the reason being is because whenever we start talking about labor power, we're talking about doing the things and activities we must work at or engage in order to reproduce society. Okay. Those are not the things that we find to be passionate endeavors, right? And throughout history, you've always had some class, typically aristocratic class, that gets to have time, energy to devote to things other than necessary labor. What they do is they find some other class to do the necessary labor, so they can sit there and engage in these, aristocratic type of pursuits. That's, to me, where the issue comes in. And so the aristocrats knew, though, oh, we can't be living our lives doing necessary labor if we're going to have good lives. Somebody else has to do that. Well, that's, of course, where the problem comes in, is I don't want anybody else to have to do that. And so the question is, how do we emancipate time energy at a universal level? This is where some part of me has to be an accelerationist. That, and to go back to your question about deceleration, I get the point of decelerating certain things, but I think the acceleration of the automation of the means of production, that is the condition of universally liberating time energy. We have to eradicate as much necessary labor as we can through automation to make time energy possible, to free it up. And so the interesting thing is, Nick Land famously says, well, if you ever have a problem, the market's the surest way to find a solution to it. So the challenge to Nick is, okay, fine, challenge accepted. Can capitalism actually be the thing that gets rid of wage labor? That seems to be this core problem, because capitalism has always been structured on the basis of wage labor. So if the problem is wage labor itself, then how does capitalism, what's its solution to it? And so that's part of what I'm getting at, is this friction or this antagonism between having time energy, or, you know, or not having time energy because you have a job, because you're stuck in wage labor. And the question is, what do we do about this antagonism? I know this, people are sick of their jobs and they don't know what to do. They don't, because your average, especially American worker, they're not sitting there, you know, saying, oh, bring on communism. They're not talking like that, but they know they do not have time and energy they never have enough time energy for their family, for their kids, to do the things that they find meaningful in life. And they know the reason they don't have it is because of their job. And yet they don't know what to do about this problem. They want less work. They want more money, but they don't want communism. And they don't want to get rid of capitalism, but they don't want nearly the amount of work. So this kind of friction is what I'm trying to address in the book, at least in part. And I think this is this issue between us and Nick. Nick is going to champion capital, and we're going to champion time energy. And as you know, there other people now are thinking more and more in terms of time energy. It's not like we're all going to be on the same page, or we're going to all, you know, think the same thing about it. But if you're sitting there going, time energy is the necessary condition, the transcendental condition of a passionate life or of the good life, then you're going to have to reckon with how capitalism structurally won't allow the vast majority of us to have our time energy.
And do you think that time energy is a better basis of a political movement than, like, let's say, having the true value of our labor be paid, or I don't know?
Yeah,
Like,
because my big issue is, again, it's not even wage labor. So, okay, there's this great line from Baudrillard, I quote it in the book, and maybe this is where I have my biggest disagreement with Marxists. Is, so Marx said the problem is with capitalism, at least in part, is that it alienates us from our labor. Right. So this is the theory of alienation, that wage labor in particular alienates the worker from their labor. Okay. But Baudrillard's point is, what if you are alienated by being designated as labor, essentially? Like, what if that's the problem? It's not like, oh, you're essentially labor, and then the problem is that your essential laboring nature gets alienated. No, you're alienated by being thought of in terms of labor. So that's where I'm Baudrillardian on that point. My issue is with us being viewed as standing reserves of labor. And this has been the problem from the beginning of human history. If you're thinking about the struggles or the contradictions that human beings have dealt with, the number one thing has been necessary labor in all modes of production. Who does the work that nobody wants to do? How do you justify it? Blah, blah, blah. And the point is, because we've never had the technology to get outside of necessary labor. It's just always been a brute human reality. But with artificial intelligence, with automation, all kinds of new possibilities begin to open up that were never possibilities before. How do we free ourselves from work as such, from labor? And what do we do if we don't work? Passion. Like, and this is the problem, that so many working class people can't even envision a life without labor or work, because they've never had the chance to live a passionate life where, and I did for a while. Okay. Like I got to live the passionate life for a while, and it's much better than the wage labor life. I can tell you that. And the idea of just being able to wake up in the morning and get out of bed and affirm what you're going to do with your day wholeheartedly, existentially, is not even a possibility most people are aware of. And so this is where I think Dave is really onto something, where he's like, there would have to be institutions to help people cultivate a passion, cultivate until it takes hold as the new norm. But here's the thing. So if anybody's watching this and they go, oh, well, you know what, that's just lofty dreaming. Here's the problem. Capitalism is in the process of accelerating and automating our jobs away. Now, what that means for our day-to-day lives is up in the air. It could go really bad, or it could be a chance at the universal emancipation of Timenergy. That's what's up in the air. This could have a terrible ending. So the question is, given the fact that capitalism is in the process of automating our jobs away, what kind of world do we want to live in once this feedback loop accelerates to the point that less and less and less of us have jobs? Now, maybe it'll be a thing where, as this process takes hold, it'll just roll back the work week. So the standard is 5 days, we'll go to 4 days, and then we'll go to 3 days. Okay. But automation is baked into the core of the capitalist economy. Marx knew this, Land knows it, and we have to be aware of this too. This is happening whether anybody likes it or not. Like, maybe you think everybody should have to have a job. Well, the long-term trajectory of capitalism seems to not care about that. And machines doing the work is the more efficient way of producing. And so what world do we want to live in if capitalism itself puts all of us out of work? That's the question. And so I want to live in a world where time energy is freed up, and that time energy, not capital, is a singularity, which is to say, what does humanity do if time energy is universally emancipated, where the vast majority of humans have the vast majority of their time energy to do with what they will? What kind of things will we get up to? It could be bad. It could be like it's a singularity in the same sense that super intelligence is a singularity. And so I'm interested in that potential, what that singularity could mean. And I'm landing in the sense of, I think capitalism already has us on this trajectory of the automation and, putting us out of work. And the question is, if this is the contradiction Marx knew, if capitalism, through its own mechanization process and automation process, puts us out of work, the machines aren't going to buy what the capitalists sell. Who's going to buy the things that the capitalists sell if none of us have wages, because the jobs have been automated away? This is a fundamental core problem for the long-term trajectory of capital. Does it give us UBI so we can consume? Does it I don't know. But this is these are the dynamics I'm really concerned with concerning the future. And for me, all I can say is I cannot begin to think them without Land, without Zizek. I know I haven't said much about Zizek here, but I can't think them without Marx. And so there's these core thinkers, and I can't think them without the concept of time energy, which is Dave's creation. So all of this is what I'm trying to wrestle with in the book. But yeah, at the core of it, it's trying to think what type of trajectory could get us to a world where human beings have their time energy.
You already know that's music to my ears since
Right.
way back since the days of Planet of the Robots, which I know you remember.
Mhm.
One of my old videos.
Mhm.
It's sort of the vision I believe in, which is, you know, time energy, you know, is to me way more important than like, and way more of a powerful message than the idea of like just being paid fairly or, you know,
I don't want a
tax.
job at all. Like, that's my
Well,
issue with
he-
that. Like in
here's
that
I've
sense.
there's parts in which I've kind of altered my position on Falc, fully automated luxury communism, which is that, and I altered it the more I encountered a lot of people with money who have a lot of free time. And what I'll say is this: what I believe in is time energy for the have-nots and degrowth for the haves. I believe in degrowth for the rich and time energy for everyone else.
Yeah.
Because I do think that, we could say this is a product of capitalism itself, and the conditions we're in. I mean, it's definitely part of it. But yeah, I do notice like tons of people who are, and I've ever since I moved to Toronto, I've encountered a lot of people like this. A lot of people who, are using their parents' money to go study art and are doing God knows what, like just kind of partying all the time, and ostensibly you'd think that they'd be so happy they're pursuing their passion, but they'll have like, 3 mental illnesses. And, turns out the core foundations of what makes an individual happy are lacking in their lives anyway. So they have money, but they don't have like a stable parent household. They don't have a community. And I think like all that is like, to me also like just as much a big case for socialism. I think like the point of socialism is to create communities,
Yeah.
you know,
And
and
that's
to
essential
enable.
to where we're coming from.
Hmm?
That's essential to where we're coming from.
Oh,
Like the
100%.
point is, I don't want people to get confused and think like, because we champion time energy and we want people to get to develop the passion, it's not like, oh, so what's your ideal image of life? Like Paris Hilton? No, it's not like
Yeah,
this
yeah,
kind of
exactly.
like
Yeah, you're not
privilege.
saying nobody should work. It's just that no one should just be. You shouldn't have a society where like most of society are designated like workers, and their whole being is deduced to working,
I don't
whereas
want
other
it to be
people get
job
the OTM.
centric. I don't think a job should be the center of our lives.
Hmm.
I even believe I call it the reverse Sabbath. Like, even if we could fully automate, I still think it's good for there to be a day set aside, even if it's not work in what we typically think of it as work. Like, what is it? Is it the Matrix Revolutions? I think it's the third one. Maybe it's Reloaded. I'm drawing a blank. It's the second or the third one, where one of the old sages of the Society of Zion is on a walk with Neo, and he's basically pointing out to Neo, like, all of this works, and yet nobody knows how it works. And I think that's a problem. There's too much fetishization in there. Like the Sabbath would be to teach everybody how the automated system works. And like it's not nature, it was made and it has to be maintained. And even if it is automatically maintained, there's there's a revelation and understanding like this configuration is fragile. It's not the way things just spontaneously are. And there's a kind of duty to know how it works in order for you to not take it as just the natural given, right? And so, and that's like an ideal scenario. So when I say I don't want a job, I'm not saying there's not a place for doing things that you don't want to do. I'm saying that a job should not be the centering, anchoring principle of what your life is. And the people I know who have worked from about as early as you can, who suffer from what Dave has also called structural stultification, where you cannot, based on your structure, based on your position as a wage labor, there are certain things you just cannot learn. You
Yeah, it's
cannot develop.
basically his euphemism for like capitalism makes you stupid.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
basically, yeah, and that's the thing is like instead of doing the personal responsibility ideology, it's like no, I mean, look, a great film that kind of gets at this structural logic of stultification is Idiocracy, right? It's like, no, this system doesn't want you to be as original as you can be. It doesn't want you to develop. It's be a mindless consumer and do whatever work you have to do and be happy with Netflix. And if you're not satisfied with that, then you're the problem. You're ungrateful, and it'll try to browbeat you with guilt or shame. This is what I call it. We call the superego. But you're not enjoying enough. You should be enjoying, enjoy. Everywhere you go in capitalist society, you hear the word enjoy, right? Every barista, every waiter, everybody bombards you with it, and if it becomes this unconscious demand and ideal, you feel like it, like Slavoj Žižek has said, like when people go into psychoanalysis now, they don't feel guilty because they did something transgressive. They feel guilty because they feel like they should be enjoying their lives more, even though they're depressed and sad and unhappy. So if you don't like the system, it has all kinds of mechanisms in place to make you feel like it's your fault or something's wrong with you. And then it'll put you into the therapy culture, take pills. You're the problem. Your brain chemistry is the problem. So it'll do that ideology instead of saying, well, maybe it's your society that's the problem. Maybe it's your culture that's the problem. But no, it's misdirect and blame the individual for not being happy in the society. Everybody else is perfectly happy. Look at all the smiling faces on Instagram. What is wrong with you? Right. So that's where this time energetic critique of capitalism is trying to open up the possibility of vision for understanding that there's more to life than your job. You could be more. It's not that you're going to ever be perfectly happy or perfectly, never be sad or never deal with problems. That's not it. It's not utopian. You're still going to have problems, even if you have your time energy. But the point is, time energy makes it possible to live a more robust life of problems. Your problems become better. You get to dwell with problems or contradictions more fully instead of just this frantic, I have no time, I have no energy, I'm zapped, I'm exhausted, I can't just go. It's the treadmill of wage labor. And I mean, so that's where the capitalism versus time energy.
Yeah, man, I think time energy is ultimately what moved me from being a social democrat to something more. I say something more because, I'll say socialist is, the most I'm comfortable defining with. People use the word communist, Marxist, whatever. But for me, it's like I like some degree of democracy, some degree of liberty. And if socialism, it means time energy, I'm a socialist. That's that what communism means. Sure. Although I'm more skeptical about the communism question, actually. In that I think that is more where people are very ambiguous in what they mean. But and this was before time energy was, articulated by Dave, but he created that vocabulary that we can use to make sense of this. Before it was more intuitive. It was like, you know, clearly something else is necessary because I found, manual labor the worst. I would avoid it like the plague. So then when I got a corporate job, or I mean, what's a government job rather, I meant to say white collar job. I thought this was, going to be so much better. And technically there's more intellectual labor there, but it was completely meaningless, useless, contributing to nothing. And that's when it really clicked for me. I'm like, I wouldn't even, if the socialism is when the government just employs everybody, the Soviet Union, I don't want to live in that either. Like, you know,
Yeah.
or if it's just like trade, you have jobs but with higher wages, it's like, well, that's not the ideal either. It's better than having bullshit jobs with low wages, but it's like, clearly we've got to have something other than just oh, let's have higher wages and tax the rich. This is where I broke with social democracy.
And I don't go for workerism, like this
Yeah.
glorification of the worker. No, the point is to get rid of this as much as we can. And that's where, there are certain Marxist types I know well, I mean, you see it in the old Soviet iconography of the worker, in the field in this glorious, man, nah, man.
Well, I get it for that context. I
Yeah,
kind of like that stuff.
fair
I
enough.
don't like Soviet Union, Soviet realism's imposition of art having to be just that. I think that was totalitarian, but I'll be honest, that kind of realist modernist style of with the Soviet realism trying to really glorify working people for once. I actually really like that because, like, in that, I mean, think about what do capitalist societies do for the most part? Is glorify like only the CEOs. It's always a CEO. He created the jobs. It's never the people who actually do the work who are ever credited.
I'm just telling you,
There's a,
but the problem,
yeah.
you run this risk of, I'm sorry, people who work in warehouses, I'm sorry, they don't have this, they don't, it's, it's ideology. It's not a glorious life. Like nobody wants to be there. Like that's not, and everybody's, they all say the same thing. Like, I don't know what I did wrong in life to end up here. So it's not like somebody who gets to be a philosopher or be a classical pianist, like who affirm, like they're glad they're in that, like these kind of necessary labor jobs or essential labor, right? It is important not to glorify them and act like, oh yeah, like, no, get rid of these jobs and let the machines do them and let humans do things that they find to be intrinsically rewarding, right? I'm People who love doing photography find it intrinsically rewarding. People who build pallets at warehouses do not find it to be intrinsically rewarding. But it's more than just that, because if you're a photographer and you're still working a typical wage labor, if your week is still structured around the same kind of temporal format of other jobs, it's that temporal format of the vast majority of your time energy is converted into labor power to be used at your job. And that's what we want to see a decline in as much as possible. And this ability to use your time energy to repetitively engage in those activities you find life affirming. I wasn't expecting us to get all this, so it turned out to be good fortune.
Okay, well, that's about what we have time for today. But this has been a splendid discussion, and I think the point worth clarifying here is that all of this is possible because of technology. I mean, like the idea of not wanting to have the concept of a full-time worker. That's possible because of technology. I mean, in theory, it might not. It might be possible if you want to accept a way lower living standard, right? In a kind of primitive communism. But in order to have some of the benefits that we have in our advanced industrial society, while everybody working way less, that would only be possible because of technology. And in that case, I'm all for the acceleration of AI and all that. So long as we can contain it. And I don't know if you saw one of the founders of AI research, supposedly, I forget his name. I always forget his name when it's time to say it. He basically, he's the same guy who's saying if AI isn't contained, it could like destroy civilization. But he also said that socialism is necessary for AI to go in a humanist direction. That's pretty big. He was like, me. This is on Sky News, like mainstream television. He's saying that, and you could tell they didn't expect he was going to say that.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling that like, is that Ray Kurzweil still alive?
Yeah, he's still right. Still working on it.
Is he for socialism?
If I had to, I heard him talk about it. See, this is the thing again. Like, this is why I like land a lot more than these guys. Is they don't seem to operate on this level of capitalism, socialism. They don't. So I don't really recall ever hearing him mention it. I mean, maybe he has, but I just feel like his answer would be what he's talking about is going to be so far beyond these types of modes of production that really we've been worried about for the last 200 years or so. Once we transcend biology and become immortal, it's a whole nother, we're beyond all that.
And I'll say this, look, because of AI, a lot of the things that I wanted to do with One Dime in like 10 years time are possible now within potentially less than 5 years time. In that, like, one of my long-term goals is to make One Dime into a think tank. So like One Dime Incorporated, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea is to kind of have research, to have educational institutions, a bunch of things, and like that requires a lot of resources. Marketing resources, organizational, secretarial resources, putting together courses. if you look at what these AI tools can do now,
I know.
it
Crazy.
is mind blowing. Like, it has completely changed the picture the more I've learned it. I was like, I could turn stuff that I wrote, into a full course with the proper prompting and with
Sure.
amazing visuals. It's absolutely splendid. And like so much laborious tasks is faster. Like research, is a lot faster now. You can cite sources easier. There's just a lot of stuff. But I would suggest don't let it replace your creativity. That's what I do worry is AI will actually replace all the creative things that are humans should be doing, like drawing, thinking of ideas, what to write, and then like doing all that stuff, and then we're stuck doing all the laborious jobs that we thought the robots were going to do. That would be the worst case scenario of AI.
Don't underestimate, and this is my Baudrillardian kind of contribution to it. Don't underestimate the human intelligence that is structured by the awareness of stakes. I don't think AI gets stakes that it might be able to predict, like, oh, if I could cease to exist or this, but it doesn't understand stakes in the existential sense that you and I understand, how we could destroy our lives or mess up a project and what that would mean for us and the people around us. We don't view this as just data to sort through. There's this dimension of concerned stakes at what could occur if we get something wrong, that I don't think it's operating on the basis of. Now, Baudrillard might just call what I'm saying with concerned stakes death. It doesn't get death the way that you and I understand it, be it social death, like I lose my reputation, or literal death, biological death, but it doesn't get death the way that we get what the stakes are in dying. And yeah, it can pump out words about death, but does it really at its core understand and have that shock wave of anxiety when it comes to the possibility of destroying ourselves, undermining ourselves, ruining ourselves if we don't get it right? I think that produces a unique type of intelligence that it doesn't have yet, and I'm not sure it will. Maybe, but maybe not.
Well, we'll have to see. Thanks for being here, Mikey.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I want to remind the audience to go check out Mikey's book. He's put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this project. And if there's any author who you should actually buy the book and not just download on Z Library, it is Michael Downs. Free Mikey, so he doesn't have to be a wage laborer, and I can actually do this full time. If you can produce this level of work under such constraints, I can't even imagine what you would produce with more otium on your side.
Would that be the Mikey Singularity?
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah, there we go.
And I thank the patrons, and patrons make this show possible, and patrons get access to the Backroom podcast. There's about 60 exclusive episodes by the time you're listening to this. You'll get access to by being a patron, and you'll get access to the second discussion me and Mikey are going to have, and I'm very excited for that. But yeah, see you in the back room, and check out Mikey's work.
Thank you.
Take care.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra